The memory stones on the Isle of Portland, south of Dorset, are a modern stone circle created by the Quarry Trust as part of a sculpture park proposed in 1963 to illustrate the geology, stonemasonry, art, deeper meaning and different perspectives of Portland stone. Hannah Sophia and Paul Crabtree told us that the stones are in a backfilled quarry area covered in an aggregate surface, as there was previously no level access. A 3D model was made and the Arts Council funding was obtained for the installation of the stones. There is a total of 254 tonnes of stone involved, and the heaviest one being 22 tonnes. A random centre was chosen and a pole set in the ground, and the stones were arranged to align with the midsummer sunrise and other sunrises and sunsets. Then it was found that the stones formed many alignments with other sites, an amazing case of subconscious sighting. The midsummer sunrise line points to Golden Cap. The north line is a line to the old St Andrew's Church, where we were to visit later, and there is a bearing through Brittany and Carnac. The north bearing points to a hump on top of the ridgeway called Binkham Bumps. It's an Iron Age burial site with a horseshoe shape. The more they looked into it, the more was found, such as 8 sites in a line to St Just in Cornwall. Also the stones were put in a 20-metre circle, which is 1/50th of a kilometre. The inner circle, the stones themselves, have a ratio of 0.016 to this, the same ratio as the variations in the Earth's orbit. Over thousands of years, this goes from circular to elliptical and back again. There were exhibits in the drill hall in Portland. This is a map of the island carved in Portland stone. These are fossilised stromatolites, a very early life form on Earth. Living ones still exist in the Hamelin Pool in Australia. Stone carved by the action of water. Ammonite fossils, an extinct form of shellfish. A mixture of fossils. Various fossils including the footprint of a 5-foot tall dinosaur. A fossilised tree trunk. Quarrymen's tools of types used by quarrymen for hundreds of years.
The church itself was designed around the Vesca Piscas by Thomas Gilbert, and it was the church that replaced the only church on the island at the time at St Andrews over there. You can't see St Andrews Church because it's halfway down a cliff, so but the tower, it's possible that if there was a tower at St Andrews Church with a pole on the end, and if you stood at the top of that tower, where there's a little room at the top of the tower, a circular room, where you can look up and down the sort of meridian and across to St Andrews. So it's possible they could have seen the pole of that tower and used that as a measuring, I don't know, a site measure, it's possible.
Digital rangefinders, don't they?
Yes, but they did have maps when the earliest map was just after this church was built, and then an even better map in 1800. So I think that helped them set out possibly the other churches, because of the way the land is, it's going to be impossible to get so much accuracy between the churches. But as Jonathan said in the talk yesterday, so many churches all around Dorset have the same measures, similar measures.
Yeah.
Different structural or sort of measurement of Portlanders, because they were different sort of people, so it's a different construct, if you like. But you have to say that on Portland, some of these churches were donated, or plots of land donated to the Methodists when these people died. So did that person know that their house was on a special place, or was it just collective consciousness that just happened to be part of all this geometry? Because nobody will admit to it. The Freemasons I spoke to here said that it was really interesting. We never realised all this was going on. But then, were they telling the truth? I don't know. Unfortunately, we can't go in St George's Church, but you can come in here later on this afternoon if any of you want to, or tomorrow if you're staying on the island. It's generally open in the afternoons at the weekend. It's open all day tomorrow. The tower is interesting. Both of you have got dowsing rods. The tower is on an alignment of churches, including Cave Hole, which is a smuggler's cave that was right under the island. And then it goes through St Andrew's Church at Southwell, and then the oldest house where the court used to meet, right through the tower of St George's Church, through a place that was called the Priory, which is now just flat land in the Tout Quarry, and then through St John the Baptist Church at the head of the line. And and that's such a powerful line. I found most dowsers can pick up that line when they walk past the tower. So if you've got your rods with you, so I know there's a few dowsers amongst you today, when we're going around the church, because we're going to go around to see Clara Kingrory's tomb in the churchyard, because it's unusual. It's almost Islamic, sort of Middle Eastern. And I've traced her family route back to that area through the Jutes and the Judes and the Kimry. So yeah, that might be interesting. So when you do get inside the church, I think you can go up the tower, and if you can go up the tower, experience the energy in that upper room. It has a circular seating, and the energy of that tower, because it's a wren tower, it's designed around wrens, so the sacred geometry there is focused on that tower, and so is the meridian. So. According to the Portland legends, the first family were the Convens, and you might see their name around the island at certain places, and they were said to be descended from Phoenicians. But the Wights were descended from the Jutes, and they came over from the Kent way. Now the Cantware were the Jutes who settled then and created Canterbury. And the Mionara settled around the Isle of Wight, and the Meon River is named after them, or they were named after the river, whatever, I'm not sure. But there were three lots of Jutes, and some were priests, some were warriors, and some were just workers, farmers, labourers, stonemasons. And it's said that perhaps King Alfred's, I think, mother was a Jute, and so Alfred's line kind of protected them, and King Eni was related to the Jutes, and it was said that King Eni took a party of Jutes rescued them from genocide, which has been committed on them in the Isle of Wight, brought them here to Portland for safety, and they became the White family, and they settled in Wakeham, which we'll see later is this long, wide street of houses with these really ancient stone Portland houses. It was Cadwallader and some other, I've got the name of the kings in my book, but he committed genocide on the Jutes of the Isle of Wight for some reason, and left only a few of the nobles, in which he absorbed into the royal families, interestingly enough. So they're obviously a very important race of people they were determined to extinguish. So the Jutes survived here on Portland in the White family, which was originally Wight, W-H-I-T, which the Isle of Wight, the Isle of Jutes became the Isle of Wight. So the Whites were very close to the Whites of here onto the Whites of the Isle of Wight. There was lots of seafaring going on, hardly any land movement. Most people on this island sailed from the island to different places. Very few people went to Weymouth. They stayed on the island. They had everything they wanted here. They also made money from shipwrecks around the island. So and of course the island itself is abundant in very fertile grass, being on this special limestone, and the sheep that were eating this grass became the most delicious mutton, and so the Queen demanded Portland mutton. This is going back to Queen Anne and before the kings. They said that the Portland mutton was the best in the country. So there's something very fertile about the island and very special. And sadly, the church here became redundant because when they built the church, they sold off the pews. So if you had money, you could buy your way into the church, into the new church. But unfortunately, because of the way that the Gavelkind custom is that everything's divided equally when the father dies amongst the family, then that everything was quartered and sectioned, so it was very difficult to find the owner of a pew if that person died, because there might be several of them who might have left the island. So in the end, the church was being opened, but there's hardly anybody in the church because you weren't allowed to take a pew of somebody who bought that pew. And so often the church is empty because the families have all gone or scattered. And that was partly responsible for the collapse of the church. And we had problems with its roof and flooding in this ground here, because it wasn't a very good place to be built. It's very exposed here, very windy. They had real problems with the structure, which is interesting because, you know, they were very clever people. Why didn't they build the church somewhere more convenient in a sheltered area? And they could have easily done that, but no, they built it deliberately here, so it's aligned to the midwinter sunrise and at this special distance that the islanders seem to use around sacred buildings in this island. So it's unfortunately, after many years, they decided to open up All Saints Church in Easton, which has got the zodiac on the ceiling, and that became the main church on the island, and this church became redundant.
Are people not buried here anymore then?
Yes,
families?
Yes, some of the leading families, and of course the stone quarriers are very rich people, and they're still making huge amounts of money, and they're still very much Portlanders, and they still are buried here in the new graveyard further down. But,
I was just chatting, Gary, to the lady that's tending the grave.
Yes.
And I was asking that question, and my first thought was there's millions of pounds worth of stone here.
Yes.
They must have been really rich. She said no.
Exactly.
I said, how come? She said she was actually tending the grave of her grandparents, her great-grandparents, but also her grandparents as well. The ashes had been scattered into that. And she says, no, everyone on the island knows somebody who can get some Portland stone for you.
Yes,
and carve it. So even the poorest
Yeah.
have got state-of-the-art headstones.
Yeah. But there are some state-of-the-art headstones here. And on that side of the church, some of the monuments are incredible. A real sort of example of the art of Portland stone carvers. As you've seen, the quarries carrying on that tradition, and the people you probably met on Friday at Hannah, I mean, they're grooming some incredible stonemasons. One particular guy I met never touched stone before, never carved a piece of stone. He had a go, and before he knew it, he carved an incredible piece, which I've put in the book. And he came to one of my talks and said, I've just taken to this stone carving. I can't understand why. I just know what to do. I can carve incredible things. And I said, what's your name? He said, Mark Pierce. And I said, that's interesting. I said, Pierce is one of the stone carvers sort of families from Portland. I said, have you looked into your ancestry? He said, no. So he came back a few months later. He said, I'm related to the Portlanders. So the gift of stone carving actually came through his DNA. Yeah, it was really interesting. It's where the sailors and the mariners and the sort of traders sort of lived. The valley leading down there is called Brands Coombe, and at the bottom there was an area called Maiden Well, and there was actually a holy well there. It's now concreted over in a kind of little parking area in Cheshire. But the name of the street still record the sacred places.
Sorry, Gary. Is it the little well as you
Brands Coombe? Yeah. And there was also a Brands Barrow over here, but underneath the burn. If you look across there, you'll see this kind of earth. It's what used to be the hill front, but it had twin ditches when they built the vertebras, which is actually inside the hill. They destroyed all that archaeology. But you can see it's a perfect spot for a lookout, which in the Old English is tout. We've got tout quarry here, lookout quarry. So it would have been a fantastic place to actually protect the harbour from any invading ships. And it's said that the hill fort was populated by slingers who could sling stones down to anybody approaching the island into this harbour. And believe you me, the Chesil Beach chert pebbles, chert is similar to flint. It's very, very hard stone. I was down on the beach a couple of years ago, and so a little child picked a piece of this Portland chert up and threw it at me, hit the back of my head, and blood just came out of my head. It was only a little child, you know, but that was a soft throw. That's what somebody said. They're trying to get at you. You shouldn't have talked about all that stuff. That was in my own beach, actually, Osmington Mills. But yeah, so they are really hard. So if one of those hit you from a sling, it would destroy your kill you easily. Yeah. So they're very effective, the Portland slingers, and the Romans even used them against the Phoenicians. So, well, not the Portland slingers, but the Balearic slingers. But Cumberlands think that they may be descended from the Balearic slingers. So it's hard to say. It's all supposition, really. But down here you've got Fortune's Well, and the Holy Well itself was at the junction where it turned sharply down to the hill, down through Branscombe. But at that junction there was a well with stones across where women would wash people's clothes. So it was a well not really for drinking, more for washing. But there may have been a well higher up behind the houses that was for drinking.
Where's John the Baptist Church from here?
So yeah, St John the Baptist Church is the tower there. Can you see it?
Oh, in the trees?
In the trees.
Oh, okay.
You just see the tower sticking up? That's on this meridian that comes through this priory corner.
From St George?
From St George's and St Andrew's Church. And it's a dead straight line. You can check it on Google Earth or any map. It's straight as a die, and it's directly sort of grid north.
The line from St Andrew's Church in Southwell to St George's Church passes through the Western Methodist Chapel, and when extended it goes through St John the Baptist Church in Fortuneswell. This line is oriented to true north and would therefore be classed as a meridian. This remarkable lay or meridian also passes through Portland's oldest building on Gypsy Lane, a thatched cottage that used to be the Lugger Inn, where the court leet used to meet at the turn of the century.
The other thing is that the buildings you can see in the harbour used to be the old military hospital. Now they're turned into flats. But that was the harbour that was built around about the 17th, 18th century. But the original harbour, which I've shown you on the old maps, the Mere, you can see where that green patch is down there. That's the naval sort of helicopter base and runway. That used to be the Mere, and it spread halfway into the Portland Marina. So it was quite a large inland lake with a wall running around and an inlet. And that was supposed to have been constructed before the Roman times, possibly by the Phoenicians themselves. And remember, there's no way, you can walk from here in those days to the mainland, but you have to walk several miles along this pebbly Chesil Beach, and believe it or not, you're exhausted after a mile. And if you try and do the 7 miles to Abbotsbury, you'll actually probably need a hospital.
Normally
there's
you get sand.
no sand in it. It's all pebbles of different gradients. So it's like walking in mud.
I can attest to that from when I was walking the St. It was my idea to walk to Abbotsbury along the pebbles, but after about a mile I was about to that.
So Gary, can I just ask a question? You referred quite a lot to the helicopter area. Is it this near green one?
The far green one.
Right over on the far side on the
The
spit?
furthest green strip.
On the causeway?
On the causeway.
On the causeway, right over there, not this near one. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, this one, not that one further over.
Oh, not over there.
if those of you could see another green strip further away, that's the route to the bridge. In old times, you had to go and stop there and be taken across by boat. So in effect, the island was really an island then, because you had to get a boat. There's no way you could walk along Chesil Beach. A horse wouldn't do it, or a man couldn't do it. But the monks, they say the Benedict...
Is that the bridge in, sort of at the end of where...
Yeah, the ferry bridge in, yeah. Now that stands... Because you can't tell it's a big bridge when you drive across it, but if you look carefully, you can see when you get near the ferry bridge in, you're going across a large bridge. And that body of water is very fast flowing. So on many days, you couldn't get a ferry across because it would just be swept away. So often you could wait 2 or 3 days for the swell to reduce in order to get the ferry across. So a lot of people found a difficult journey to go into Portland. You were lucky if the tide was right.
Which is in town.
Which the church, St George's Church we went to.
Angle Battery.
Angle, thank you.
Really help. Thank you, Tony. Appreciate it loads.
Are we almost here? A few more. There's a lot of cruises that go up and down the channel now, just purely doing the channel trips. Ports along, and Portland is one of the places they stop at to refuel because it was old naval yard. It's got huge fuel tanks. So it's a great place to stop, but none of them, they don't really get off the boat here. They just stay on board and indulge themselves, as we know.
I see a lot advertised go around Britain. They go to the Scilly Isles and then storm away. And
yes, exactly. This is one of the stops for them, because you'll see the harbour wall going around. That was built in Victorian times. And that, so it wasn't ancient. The older harbour was where I showed you before, but further across you can see another couple of cruise ships, those white boats. Because where we live across the bay there, they gather there because there's a huge stretch of limestone under the water and the anchors can grip to it. And it's free parking for ferries. So of course we've got the Verne, we can still see the Verne, the top of the Verne Hill Fort in the distance there. Between that point and that point, with the kind of communications satellite ball in the middle. Nicodemus's Knob down here, that shows you the height of the land before they quarried it away. The top of Nicodemus Knob was the height of the land. So we're probably still a little bit below land level here. But this area that you now stood on, a lot of healers came to Portland during the 90s, felt drawn to it, rather like all sacred places. And they felt they had to find somewhere on the island to gather the energy. So they came to Grove, and they didn't like the prison energy over there. So they found this spot here, and they found that the energy was very, very peaceful. And while they were here, they noticed the full moon at the equinox rises behind St Alban's head. And that was very powerful too, because St Alban was also the saint of the stonemasons, the early stonemasons. So, and that the quarrying that went on St Alban's head is more to do with the name came about from the quarry workers than it was St Alban, one of the first martyrs in Britain. But people think it should have been Oldheim, who was a bishop who owned all the lands in southern Dorset. He was a bishop of Salisbury. I think he became Bishop of Canterbury, I'm not sure. But Oldheim was a very powerful bishop, and there was a church to St Oldheim on the quarries as well. So that you've got Albans, A-L-B-A-N, apostrophe S, head, and St Oldheim, H-E-L-I-M, church nearby. And so some people think, oh, they got confused, but of course the name of the head was belonged to the quarry workers, whose martyr, because apparently it said that St Alban brought stone quarrying methods into Britain as well as Christianity. So in Freemasonry, St Alban's a very special saint. And I've seen the full moon rise from that special point. And it's actually on an axis, as Peter Knight noticed, to do with the equinox as well, and sunrise. So this spot's quite special here, so lots of people have gathered. on the full moon, watch the full moon rise out of the sea, which is quite special here because you see all kinds of strange colours, and watch sunrises out of the sea as well. Because we're jutting out from the mainland and we see these accurate sunrises without any pollution of the land. We can get really accurate measurements of the sun and moon's rising and setting here, which is why they believe there's so many stone circles on this part of the island. Underneath that horrible prison over there was one stone circle. There was another stone circle that fell down the cliffs here towards where their lorries are now. But part of it was standing just by Nicodemus's Knob in the 19th century, just an arc. But the other arc was down in the weirs. Same thing further down. So why so many stone circles? It must have been something to do with the energy here. And it's also on a fault line with different types of limestone. And I noticed that where the stone circles are positioned around the island, they're under these fault lines, as if the energy from the fault has been drawn up through these aerials or stones. The stones were acting like aerials and discharging the energy that's built up from the land to make it more stable. So some stone circles, I believe, were actually stress relievers and not sacred sites, because some of the stone circles you see around South Dorset are very small and their stones don't align to anything. Some do. Some have openings and outliers where you can actually see it was a calendar, a local calendar, or a place to connect with at certain times of year. But on Portland they are more like stress relievers, because this island has suffered from earthquakes, it's suffered from tsunamis, it's suffered from fractures and fissures and landfalls, especially this side. So if you know how to relieve stress from the land by placing stones at certain ideas like aerials, but I suppose they'd have to use dowsing to know exactly where to put the stones, even then. But Portlanders say that they used to have the power. All the early families, the local families, Combans, Pierces, Whites, Lano, so many Atwall, they all were said to have the power. And when I met one of the last families on the island, they said that they all got the sixth sense, the second sight. And that went also into the quarrying. We were talking about this before with you, that certain stone masons who have got the gift know where to cut the stone, how to balance it, how to lift it, and find ways of moving stones that we couldn't. And it's finding its point of balance. And somebody with a kind of psychic gift like that could tune into the stone and find out how to move that block or where to cut it. Because I've seen some people really struggle with their chisels, cutting the stone, trying to get it flat, and another guy comes along and goes bang, 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 and it's done. And you think, how does he do that? No, and your chisel must be sharper. It's not. He just knew exactly where to hit it.
It's going with the grain or going against the grain.
Yeah, and maybe he even tuned into the stone and raised its vibrations so that it was easier to cut. Who knows? Because everything vibrates, all the molecules and everything vibrate. Stone vibrates at a lower frequency to water. So if you find out what vibration that stone is at and work with that vibration, you could actually cut it easily, move it easily. And maybe some of the secrets to stone working and stone moving is about, tuning into it and having that psychic sense.
Yeah, tuning into that vibration.
Sadly, down here they're building a waste disposal unit, which is going to burn all the rubbish from Weymouth and the areas. We kind of all protested about it, but they reckon it's safe. It's not going to cause too much disruption because, well, the rest of the island's a bit of a mess anyway. But I mean, from this point onwards, once we get past the prison, you'll find some beautiful walks that will be walking down towards Rufus Castle, Churchill Cove, and it becomes a magical place. This side of the island's been overworked for centuries. These quarries here that we're standing in were the earliest quarries on the island, and they were cut and fractured and pushed over the side, collected at the bottom onto piers and sent out to London after the Great Fire. Because we all know the story that Wren had already made plans for London before the fire, as if Wren himself lit the match. But of course, there must have been plans to. Is it Charles II? Was it? I can't remember. At the time, it was his mastermind as well. He's the one who appointed Wren to create. He wanted to recreate the shining city of light like Rome and Paris. But Portland stone was chosen to be the stone to create this energy and power. And I think Portland stone does have an energy and power. And those of you who sit with the stone, touch it, even climb it. Well, I've known climbers find they get a high when they climb on Portland stone. If you're sensitive, those of you who are sensitive will feel some magic about Portland stone. Some don't. It's like, for some people it is like Moramite, but for me, being a sensitive, I've found after walking the pass a few times, there's something about the magic of the island that gets into your blood. And even though visually it's a mess, there's something there. Perhaps some of you already feel it, or will feel it on parts of this walk.
Don't you think that with limestone, this is my take, limestone is composed of living entities, and that life is still contained within the stone.
It is. It's,
and that memory yes. Of that sense, yes. Sentience, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, you're exactly right, because the American Indians call limestone spirit stone, because it contains the spirits of the earth. Every layer is a sediment that's fallen from the sea, a shallow sea, onto the sea floor, and in that sediment is a record of what the atmospheric conditions were. If there was a war, if there was a climatic, if the comet had hit the Earth at that time, or if there was a tsunami, it would be recorded in that layer. So in a way, it's layer after layer of Earth's history. And so therefore, when you touch limestone, you're touching Earth's history. But that's why they call it spirit stone, whereas granite and sandstone is born out of cataclysmic occurrences where land has been moved quickly and covered and pushed and squashed quickly. Say a volcano exploding, comet hitting the earth, a huge earthquake, all those things, lava of course, all those things. So the granite and sandstone have very high energy because they're full of crystals, and they're great for getting all kinds of recharging energies. But I find after a while the chalk and the limestone is much more sort of lunar and sort of sedate and sort of almost calming. But then Portland stone also has a layer that's full of flint and chert and quartz. So when you look at the cliffs, I'll show you later, you've got layers of quartz, layers of limestone, layers of chert, layers of limestone. That's organic and inorganic, or inert and electromagnetic stones.
Yeah.
So you've got the layering, like Silbury Hill. Balls of light have been seen here all over the island since the earliest times, and the balls of light have manifested as fairies because they're the trickster energy, and then they've manifested as black dogs. When the concept of the big cats came along in Dorset, people started to see them all over the island. Yeah. And how did the big cats get across the causeway? Because it's full of cameras and everything, nothing was seen. But interestingly, one person in the quarry spotted a large black puma and followed it, and saw it just go poof, disappear, as if it came from either another dimension, another vibration, or it wasn't its true form. It morphed into that form through our consciousness, and in that consciousness we've got black cats everywhere.
If you want to know about black cats, come and speak to me later. I've had a very close encounter with a black puma.
Really?
And I would say it came from another dimension.
Yeah. I'll tell you about my big cat experience, because I'm a painter and decorator, and I was working in Dorchester, and I had to drive home to Bedminster, which is North Dorset, and it cuts right across the downs where the great masts are.
They tested the gerbils went.
Yeah, that's right. And it was night time, it's around about 6 o'clock during the winter, and in front of me was another car. His headlamps were on full beam, and in front of his car a big cat just ran across the front of him galloping, in full flow, like ba-dum, ba-dum, legs going out. And you could see, and it's long tail. That's what I noticed. It's really long tail. And I thought, that has to be some kind of panther or puma. I'm not sure, but it was black because it lit up in his headlights. And this guy sort of slowed down, and I was just amazed as him, but he didn't stop. He just carried on, thinking, no, it can't be. And then a few months later, on the way to work, I stopped at the side of the road to turn right, and I looked in the bush, and there was a fawn-coloured big cat just sat there. And I looked at it, and it looked at me, and it just got up and just turned around and sloped off.
Really?
And I've told people about it, and in that area, and nobody believed me. But then I was working on a farm up in that area a few months later, and this guy said he'd had sheep taken, and he found them up a tree. So, and he said when he come to sort of chase off this cat, he said it just disappeared. He said he couldn't find it back. He said, how come it come into this world, taken food and gone out of this world? And then I realised that a lot of these places are where ley lines cross or energy lines cross, and there was kind of electromagnetic field was strong at the time, and they'd found a window through. I don't know. But Portland's the key, finding these big black cats all over the island. Several reports just after the first reports appeared, and a book came out on it in Dorset. It got into the consciousness of people. Just in the old days, as we all read about fairies and things like that, people were seeing them everywhere, in all different forms. But if you ask that creature to show its true form, it will turn into a ball of light. And the Portlanders talk about the nanny diamonds that flit about in the walls of the island, on top of the island, near Southwell. And there's a lane there still called Fairy Lane, where they're often seen at night. And some of these little lights would actually start to morph into creatures and scare them off, even black dogs, huge black dogs. So.
I mean, not saying it's a black cat, but there probably are escaped from pets
as well.
Yes, true. I mean, they're not all time hoppers. There are some genuine cats, like the farmer who found some cat dung, and actually showed it off at a Portland fair. He said, look, I got cat dung, and it was. It was very fibrous, and it matched all the sort of the research he'd done at zoos and everything. So, yeah, there is evidence of them.
Liminal creatures, it's like I was saying, there's this narrative strange land. There's this important truth about electromagnetic energy and portals and liminal space. And how we colour it, the story we make, is just what's in our consciousness at the time.
Exactly, that's what I meant to say, yeah.
In South America, you've got the puma and the ayahuasca experiences. They always have a puma coming to them.
Yes, it's like, the spirit animal.
Yeah. So it's obviously worldwide.
So this is a good spot to absorb the sort of gentle Portland energy, where all the healers have been. So we're now going to sort of head towards the prison. If some of you want to go into the prison, that's fine by me.
No, thank you.
But we're gonna go around the front to where the old stones were, and you can look at some of the old gnarled standing stones.
The impressive Romanesque church of St. Peter's at the Grove, now closed.
The future is uncertain. It is actually a treasure. There's a pulpit in there, I showed you on the slide, carved a massive piece of Portland stone in and out. It's
St. Peter's.
It's full of treasures, St. Peter's Church. Yeah. And it was easy because they cut the stone up here, it'd fall down into the wares, they'd pick it up down there.
On the coast, southeast of the Heights Hotel, is the Grove, a place revered by the old Portlanders. Here stands a large, foreboding Victorian building made of Portland stone, formerly Portland Prison, and now the Young Offenders Institution. In 1847, locals protested at the destruction of the Druid Circle to make way for the hastily built prison that was to house the convict workforce, brought to the island to build the breakwater. Later, the sacred stones became a rockery in the garden of the prison governor's house, but later removed to the sea wall because of their pagan associations. In 1840, a few years before the building of the prison, the travelling antiquarian Fido Lunetz visited the Grove accompanied by a local surgeon. There he found an ancient British earthwork on the cliffs at the grove, now destroyed, called Arran's Green, where a local tradition says a great battle took place. Directly below it, in the weirs, they could see the remains of some circles, with stones measuring 5 to 6 feet square, and a cromlech, with a capstone that measured 18 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 4 feet thick. Today, the sea wall, opposite the end of Grove Road, contains some unusually large weathered stones. There are also megalithic stones in the wall along Eastern Lane that stand out among the smaller ones in areas known to have had stone monuments. Elizabeth Pearce mentions that the locals or quarrymen were superstitious of these stones, so perhaps when they quarried the area they refused to break them up and risk the wrath of the Druids, and so preserved them close to where they originally stood.
You said you were saying it's got shells in it?
Yeah, it's full of shells. You can see it, and these little holes that weathered through, been immersed in shallow seas, of course. This is a rather large stone, and these came from the Governor's Garden, which is just over there, which I'll show you after, which was a henge structure with a ditch and bank. And the stones were seen in the 19th century and the 18th century by Clara King Warrior and her grandmother. Henge, but without large stones.
What, here?
Yes. Yeah, so it had its own ditch and bank, which means it was a special place, because henges are rare structures. And so if it had a ditch and bank in it, it was a very special stone circle. Yeah. And that's because the rock and the stone here and all the fissures create the energy.
Before the landslip, this was henge in the middle of the island rather than by the coast.
Well, there's a debate whether landslip started just beyond here. We don't know. It's possible that this may have been, because it went like that, so it would be gradually going out to its furthest point opposite Rufus Castle. So it could have started from here. We don't know.
Where's Rufus Castle?
Doesn't it? Rufus Castle, we're heading there next.
Okay. And with the head, is it here or further up?
The head is over this wall on the cliffs. If we go further down, out to the way the camera's here, and then you take your drone out and along the coast, you'll see a lovely view of the head.
Looking up at the grove from the Undercliff area is the outline of a giant's head that at first appears to be natural weathering. Later I discovered that during the Victorian period this section of cliffs had the name Nicodemus Knoll. In the Grail legends, Nicodemus fashioned the head of Jesus on a day that he'd seen the Lord on the cross. Was the giant's head fashioned by the old quarryman? In Governor's Garden, where there was the site of a stone circle. There is a line which connects St Catherine's Hill, an Iron Age hill fort near Winchester, with the site of a stone circle on the Isle of Portland and Chertsey Abbey. It also goes through the stone in the New Forest, marking the spot where King William Rufus, son of William the Conqueror, was killed, and they call the line the Rufus Line. It crosses the Isle of Portland through Victoria Square Eastern. It leads up to the north-eastern cliff range, going through the Grove Young Offenders Institute. There was a stone circle on this site before the present building was put up. The line then crosses Weymouth Bay to St Oswald's Bay, partway between Durdle Door and Lulworth Cove. Approaching London, it goes through the site of Chertsey Abbey. Because it goes through Chertsey Abbey, it would seem to have a connection with a message received in connection with the UFO landing in Rendlesham in 1980. Full details of this can be seen on the video Rendlesham Time Traveller's Update, The Significance of Chertsey Abbey. This is on the James Goddard Mysteries channel on YouTube. Above Church Ope Cove, precariously perched upon a high rock platform, is Rufus Castle, also known as Bow and Arrow Castle. The castle is an irregular five-sided building that is most unusual and rare, and is the only one of its kind in Britain. The castle is a credit to the stonemasons who fashioned the walls in stone without mortar in the Cyclopean way of building, more common to the prehistoric temples of Europe than a supposed Norman castle. John Hutchins, a 16th century antiquarian, wrote, "But little mortar has been used in the construction of the walls, which are roughly built of native ashlar."
Time of William II, or William Rufus, who, as we know, was so-called assassinated in the New Forest and buried very quickly in the choir of Winchester Cathedral without ceremony, because he was known to be a wicked man. And it's strange enough that after he was buried, not long afterwards, the tower of the cathedral collapsed upon his grave, which made the curse sort of come true in a way. But we're not even sure if it was Rufus. It was probably a tower heap of something much larger, because above here, where those trees are at the top, there was a meadow that had a ditch and bank around it, which was probably the bailey. So it was probably a Motte Bailey, which would have been contemporary with Rufus, because Motte Baileys were built around his time, all around the country, defences. Now this here hasn't been quarried right the way to the castle, because a lot of that collapsed. There's etchings I've seen of this with another sort of 10 yards of land on this side, so that collapsed and left that. But it's precarious. It could collapse any time. We don't know, because there's lots of these fissures and cracks. You can see that crack there. You can actually get inside that crack and feel the quality of it.
No, you didn't go down. Yeah, it was.
That thick layer there is the best quality stone, the Whitbed stone, and the stone below it. So the quarrymen are most sought after that layer there. So that was extracted from throughout most of the island. Now if you look down at some of the lower levels, you can see the chert and the flint, these black lines. So that's the sort of crystalline layers. So we get this organic and inorganic layering.
So how come that appeared then, Gary?
The church is probably created under sort of cataclysmic circumstances, so we don't know what happened then, but something caused a huge amount of area of land to be compressed very quickly to create crystal. So crystals formed under heat and compression, or even ice and compression. So something happened to the earth to cause that black layer, and there's many of those layers. So we can say that the Earth at the moment, if you look at geology, is going through a kind of peaceful time, because in the past it hasn't been so peaceful. What geology tells us is that cataclysms are inevitable at some stage, but we're talking millions of years, thousands of years. And the upper layers are more about tsunamis and silt and destruction from the sea, rather than through major cataclysmic events where whole landslips occur and land has been pushed under the sea or pushed out of the sea. Just beyond Rufus Castle, we're going to go down to later on, or now, I'm not sure, we might go now actually, and then come back to the museum and have a rest at the museum. So we're going to go down to St Andrew's Church, which is on a ledge below the castle, and have a quick look. I know it's going to be tricky with all of us, but at the St Andrew's well, the sort of five-sided well sort of chamber, that you have to sort of be quite brave enough to get on your knees and crawl into it. But somebody with a camera like you can go in there, I think. Or somebody who's intrepid will get a picture and see all the pillars inside. Some think it's from Roman times, some say it's medieval, some say it was from 19th century quarriers who were working in the area and they needed a supply of water. But if you look at the quality of the ashlar stones that form the chamber, rather like the stone chamber at Glastonbury Holywell, that's the Chalice Well, they're made from well-cut blocks that seem to be more medieval than they are of the 19th century. But then the 19th century stonemasons were also brilliant stonemasons, as you've seen from the bridges. So it's probably a good question for dowsers to go in there and ask how old it is. So it's something I've never really looked at, that aspect of it, so I know there's some really good dowsers amongst you here, so maybe that might be a quest. And then we've got St Andrew's Church, where we've got the ruin. The walls are only about this high, but that's what drew me to the island, a line that connected to where I was living on the mainland near Beer Regis, drawn me to that point. For some reason, I knew what it was eventually, because that led me to discover that that was the only church on the island at one time. And people living down in Chesil, right at the bottom there where the two pillars are, they'd walk up here on a Sunday to this church, and people living down in the Bill would walk up. There was no other church on the island, so you can imagine it was they were dedicated people. And that church was once a fabulous Norman building, very richly carved. In the museum we'll see some of the fabulous stones from that early church. But unfortunately the French came here in this cove, set fire to the church, killed loads of people, and it was rebuilt, but not in a very good way. And that was partly its demise as well, because the fabric soon started to crumble and the cliffs falls caused lots of chaos. The cost of keeping it together was too much. It was actually cheaper for them to get a donation from King George and build a new church on the top of the island. But it's still revered, because even long after people were coming here for services, they were being buried within the church itself, because it's hallowed ground. And when you go down there into that church area, you'll feel that hallowed ground, because I know you're all very used to it, and all our trips around the Ballina Side, sacred places, you'll feel that. And I shouldn't be priming you here, I should say no, it's the worst place in the world. But no, it is a wonderful spot. And Church Up Cove here, down here, is said, according to Portland traditions, where the first Vikings invaded England. And I think that's a bit of a head scratcher, because the Vikings were over in Scandinavia. Why didn't they just invade sort of Northumbria? Why come all the way down the coast around all these areas to invade here? But the history books still say, you know, the earliest landings of Vikings was here in Church Up Cove. Unless they knew something about this island and its people.
Because the Normans were Viking descendants. Could there be some?
That's a good question. The Norse, Normans, Vikings, they're all
the same family.
Yeah, Northern Sea peoples, same families.
The Normans were from Rollo the Walker.
Yeah, who settled, and back through the kings.
The Norsemen who settled with him basically interbred with the people, and that's how the Normans.
They might have wanted to reclaim this.
Well, I've got a better theory, and it's Saint Samson of Dol wrote in his 6th century book that there was a plague that hit southern Britain in the 6th century, about 540, and that plague caused devastation throughout southern England, more southern, not northern England. And those with money, he said, those who could afford it, went over to the area of Gaul and called it New Britain, eventually named Brittany. And that's why when you go over to Brittany, a lot of the churches are 5th, 6th century saints. British, Cornish actually, saints. And so Brittany became a kind of colony of refugees from this yellow death, they called it, because it affected your liver and made your skin go yellow. And it was a devastating plague. And all the leading families who had the money, who were the kings, local kings who lived in Brittany, came back with the Norman kings and retook their lands. That's what he said. And I found evidence of that from even a family called the Lowthers up in Cumbria, who had owned land before the Norman times and then retook it again as the Lowthers in the Norman times. So, well, the place names, yeah, the Viking place names. Ope, this is called Church Ope. It means open, is a Viking word for opening. Right. Or op.
I came across a single written record about the Vikings. 3 ships landed there.
Yes, it's recorded in the Saxon Chronicles.
Yeah, it predates the Lindisfarne landings. I think it's about 20 years prior to that. But 3 ships, they'd obviously lost roughly where they were, and got met. Obviously, didn't understand. And what happens when 2 groups of people come together who are carrying weapons that. Yeah, bit of a kerfuffle, and then
it was Charmer, the first land, I think. Charmer.
They found some Viking graves when they dug the bypass between Dorchester and Wareham.
The first boat was supposed to land in Charmer, in Anglo-Saxon Chronicles.
Okay, I didn't know that one. But archaeology shows that there was a Viking settlement between Weymouth and between Portland and Dorchester when they dug the bypass out recently. So yeah, there is evidence the Vikings were here. Also, the oral traditions still talk about the horrible night when they came, because they came on more than one occasion. The poor old Portlanders were subject to many invasions, including the French. So they lived in fear half the time. But they were well versed in slinging stones and communication around the island and their lookouts and their tout areas. So and also for the Vikings, it's a very difficult island to conquer because of its cliffs, and only two places of landing here, and the mere on the other side that I showed you. The rest is all cliffs. It's impossible to get your boat near at all.
I'd rather be a defender.
Yes. Yeah, so you're pretty much safe here. To be attacked here, they must have wanted something here.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. When Cromwell came onto the island, because they were very much, this is a royal island, it never belonged to the people. They were staunch royalists, and so Cromwell punished the island by destroying its best building, which they call the vicarage, but that's a load of rubbish. It was actually a beautiful church, almost like a little priory, and some of the pictures that I've got in my book show it to be a church, and it's probably one of the missing churches, but it became a parsonage for the Church of St Andrews at one stage because it fell into ruin. But I believe it's one of the earliest, one of the only medieval buildings on the island, but unfortunately, as usual in 1900, they took away the stone from beneath it and it became the cenotaph in London. So it came out of beneath that building. So one of the sacred points of the island where lots of sort of ceremony took place, that energy went into the stone below and that became the cenotaph in London.
Good Lord. Transmutation, is that transmutation? Transmutation.
About the hive now.
When you move some energy with a physically, or
no, this was one of the higher points at the time. The thing is, you see the arrow, the arrow slits, the holes inside. They're all pointing landward. There's no arrow slits pointing towards the sea. So doesn't that tell you something?
No, I wouldn't get it that clear.
That they're more prone to attack from the land than they are from the sea. And that's
so that wasn't sea then?
Well, that's right. This was land up until 1099, when a good portion of it was pushed over by a great tsunami. Yes, pushed the land into the sea. And then after a couple of years, everything grew back again. You wouldn't know that they'd had a tsunami. But the locals all knew it because it killed half the island. The population of the island went completely down then for a couple of hundred people.
I'm amazed anyone survived.
But that's a good view. Kissing couple.
You've got a pen.
But those huts down there are privately owned by Portlanders and they're often handed to the next member of the family. Very few times they come up for sale. If they do, they can get £50,000-60,000 for a wooden hut.
They seem to have
I was just wondering about that.
It's not there.
Have you eaten?
She's returned to us.
On a terrace below the castle is the ruin of St Andrew's Church, once the oldest and at one time the only church on the island. In the 1970s, archaeological excavations revealed Romano-British pottery and an Iron Age coin under Saxon foundations, and the footings of an impressive Norman church. Portland traditions state that a temple of Venus occupied the site in pre-Christian days. If this tradition is true, the temple may have been a Romano-British shrine dedicated to the Roman goddess, or a stone circle used as an observatory to mark the rising of the planet Venus. King Warry refers to this area around the church and castle as the high place and God's acre, once the centre of the island before a landslip. Clara King-Worry writes in The High Place in 1908, "Roughly this place, High Place, is still central as regards north and south, though it ceased to be equidistant between east and west after the great cataclysm about 1100 AD, when the undersea earthquake which wrought havoc in the Channel Isles, fortunately confined to a small place, found its vibrations felt on the opposite shore, and caused the disappearance of half of Portland on the southeast. Happening at night, the terrors were thereby doubled, and as late as the early 19th century, the terrible havoc wrought and the consequent fears of the islanders remained an often told tale."
Beyond that, we had a separate tower. The tower stood separate from the church and stood very high, which makes me think maybe that was a way of connecting with the other churches. I don't know. But the strange thing is, it was reported by a Mr. White, who wrote Methodism on Portland, that there was no bells used in the tower. So they didn't know what the tower was for. Perhaps the tower was used as a beacon or a sort of early warning for ships. I don't know. But no, as far as he knew, there was no bells ever used in the tower. So it wasn't a bell tower, but it was freestanding, separate from the church. So there's a mystery in that itself. Because, well, yeah, and also they found, when they did an archaeological excavation here in the 70s, they found a Saxon church in the lower levels. The Saxon churches, as you'll see in the Winterbourne church, had separate round towers. And it's possible there was a separate tower there that would probably replace the Saxon tower that was separate from the church. Let's say there was quite a large porch, and the entrance was on each side. Because believe it or not, the road used to come down from this side of Rufus Castle, from near the museum, and in the front, and everybody came into the church through a door halfway down the chancel, sorry, the choir, and coming into there. But that was another door going, the south door. No, that was the east door. So lots of people came in the west door.
This church is not cardinally arranged, is it? It doesn't feel like that, does it?
No, it's almost directly south.
Yeah.
But it's slightly off. It is. It had to be built here because of the lay of the land. They couldn't have built it. So. But they built it in this lee, if you like, or terrace, because it was safe from the winds and the structure could survive better. But how they managed to create this geometry from this church, being so far down in the middle, for me the only way they could have done it is, because even if they use rods or rope, you've got to allow for the slope going up and then across the land. Unless you had a very high pole at the top of the tower which you could measure from.
Yeah.
It's all part of the great mystery, isn't it?
Yeah. That would make sense, wouldn't it?
But this was a hallowed ground to the stonemasons, and so there's lots of graves, and as I was saying before, some of them continued to be buried here long after the church was pulled down. And it was pulled down as a quarry for local people, so lots of people took away the stone of their old church. Perhaps every islander took a stone from here because it was sacred and put it in their house. That's probably why there's not much left of it. So yeah, I think that's about all I can remember. They found Iron Age coins here, so it's possible there was an Iron Age temple, and King Worry, from her oral traditions of Portland, said there was a temple here in Roman times, possibly a temple to Venus. What that means to Venus, whether that means the planet Venus or the goddess Venus, it's hard to say, because from what I know, the Venus tends to rise over this side, but sometimes in the opposite side, isn't it? So I'm not sure it'd be a good observatory for Venus. Perhaps the bill would be best for that. So it's possibly a goddess temple.
Maybe a point on the pentagonal pattern that Venus makes in the sky. Perhaps it's reflected on the ground somewhere, and this is one of the 5 points.
Yes, that's possible. Yeah. There's also the iron ingots that I showed in the slide, that are from 500 BC, that are in the cabinet in there, and they are an anomaly because archaeologists like to think any civilized people here were Romans, and peoples before they were just primitive farmers. But the iron ingots show that we were trading with metals, and 500 BC was quite early. But we can tie it up with all kinds of traditions and legends. But interestingly, when they were digging up the burn for the prison, they found over 100 of these coffins, and they were all hand carved inside and out, sloped. Why do you think they were sloped? Anyone?
The rain to run off.
For the rain to run off. So that means they weren't meant to be buried.
No.
But they were all buried deep down in the burn. So what does that tell you? That either, like the Portland beehives, they once stood on the ground, but something, earth covered them. The only mysterious thing is that how is that possible? Because the weight of earth that pushed across the island would sweep away the coffins, smash them up, smash the beehives, so that doesn't make sense. So it'd have to be some kind of gentle flooding, silting, to stop it, like almost like a kind of flooding. Or
well, some tsunamis, they do come in like that, don't they, as a flood?
This has happened around the world, hasn't it? Where the silt has come up.
Yeah, they were saying it
and then
usually is like
drained
that.
and turned into earth.
Yeah.
And then becoming underground. And of course,
a wave of silt before them.
And when they took away the earth inside of these coffins, they hadn't been disturbed, so they weren't buried.
No.
They've been submerged by earth, which is a bit of a head scratcher, but you know the truth lies there somewhere.
Yeah, they were saying on the programme that the way they show in the films coming up like that isn't how it actually comes into the earth, the inland. It just comes as loads of water. But
well, I know the flooding that happens in Dorset the water comes up through the wells and the fissures and floods the house and knocks down the street.
Is this the same kind of time you mentioned in your book where they witnessed these skeletons, these large skeletons on the ground? Is it the same place?
Yes, in the cracks in the Verne, because at one side of the Verne there's a big steep ditch, trench, which you walk past. Further on at that trench there are fissures, and when some of those were opened up, they saw deep down these giant bones, and some people believe that they were the bones of giants, but they were never really recovered. But they were seen and witnessed, and it's recorded by Eddie Waring in his Ghosts and Legends of Dorset, I think.
So were they definitely human?
But the mystery, before I go on to another thing, the mystery is that some of these coffins were much larger than you see here. Some of them were supposedly up to 10 feet long, some were 8 feet. One of them was 7 foot something with the bones of a warrior in them. This is in Susan Palmer's Portland archaeology book. So what happened to the bones of that warrior who was over 7 foot and his wife beside him, we don't know. Or what even happened to the coffin. Everything seems to be quickly destroyed on this island. If they found a beehive chamber, they'd probably fill it with concrete like they did in the 50s.
Well, you were saying that down at the church that it was the politicians' elite. Oh, well, maybe there's a network there that is creaming them all up.
But the money made out of Portland stone, if something stops that trade, for them it would be devastating. For us it would be great because we'd have more heritage in our history to look at, and some of the mysteries to open up to people. But then, you know, they don't want that kind of they don't want the chronology of history messed about with either, do they? They want to keep that with all those reputations of all the archaeologists who have spent a lifetime teaching their sort of ideas, and to say that they're wrong now would be like ripping up your exam papers. Everything has to stay as it is. And so watch any anomaly. So they keep the little coffins that are 6 foot long and destroy all the ones that were bigger. One of the mysteries, and one of what I used to call the wonders of Portland, but I've been getting a lot of stick from it over the years by Portlanders, but just round the corner here there's another Portland coffin. By the side of it there's a stone head.
Oh yeah.
And the reason why I find it's a mystery, even though people say it's a 1950s garden ornament, is because it was found underneath a house, a garden, in Eastern Lane, when a guy was digging the foundations of a tree much further down, about 3 or 4 feet down. He found this stone head, and he set it up in his garden as a feature because he thought I'd make a good gnome or something. And Portland people started to bow to it and actually called it Yuri for some reason, which is very strange, which they say is an old name for George, I don't know. Or a Russian name for George, is that right? Yuri, are you here?
I think it is.
No, he's not here. But anyway, he had enough of people coming to his garden to worship the stone or bow to it, that he brought it to the museum, and it's been here ever since. And I looked at it and it's the most unusual head. If you look at yourself, it's got a Mohican hairdo, strange ears, slanted eyes, almost Chinese, a very pointed beard like a Chinese. Some people say it's Pan, and it could be an old representation of Pan, which would be interesting in itself if it was old. But because it's a mould, I thought at first it was granite, but I know now that it's a composite poured into a mould. And it looks like granite, but it's not, because I had an expert look at it. But he said it was a one-off sculpture that somebody had made, not a mass-produced garden ornament. But
is it in here?
It's in there. A picture of it is in there.
Yeah, if you find it.
Well done.
I remember seeing the picture in there.
Lawrence has got a rare copy of my book.
Oh, is that one that you say that looks like a Phoenician features?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Oh, I can visualise it in my head. Yeah.
It looked a very Phoenician head to me.
It did, yeah.
There we go. Rock here. It's the most southerly tip of the island. It juts out and further south. The Armada battle to be going in favour of the English, because one of the English ships sheltered in one of the bays up here, and he knew the currents. This Neolithic bank barrel here is very similar to the one found at the Cursus at Stonehenge, and there are other Cursuses in Dorset, as you probably know about. The purpose of Cursuses we don't know. They say they were probably ceremonial walkways, places, trackways for people to race, or like having games at seasonal times of the year, festivals. Every phase of human history has left its mark on this hill, from early Neolithic times right the way up to Romano-British, and they've all added something to the hill. So it's not just a hill fort for protecting cattle, it is a sacred place. There's all kinds of strange things that go on here, I'll go into afterwards, but just on the official history line, the Neolithic village was here on the east side of the hill fort, and it's slightly raised here. You'll see as we walk up there's a slightly raised area. This bank has gone now, but this was the original Neolithic A area, and lots of pottery have been found there, but also lots of chalk effigies of the goddess, like those that found in Malta. So some of the artefacts have been identified to have come from the Mediterranean and Brittany, So some of the archaeologists believe that a Neolithic tribe from Brittany came and left their mark here too. Probably those from Karnak. The bank barrow, we don't know what that is, but that came later, and a later Neolithic time. And they put the bank barrow straight through their ramparts, so it overlaid them. So obviously something changed in the castle from being a village to a more sacred ritual place. Now the entrances you see there are much later. In the Bronze Age times, they built the first bank and barrow around here, and the Bronze Age people settled in the area. A dew pond was here, but still it wasn't a place of refuge. It was more of a ceremonial place, visited at special times of the year, as we know, summer solstice, equinoxes. Then something happened then when the Beaker race came, just after the Beaker race. There was a kind of climatic change. The hill fort was abandoned, and it remained so right up until 500–600 BC, when they started to refortify the hill, and right up to 50 BC. This is the great phase of building the great ramparts and the entrances. It's thought that perhaps the Iron Age peoples were either a race that came across from the continent and fortified themselves here, being separate from others, or something was going on whereby they had to protect their cattle because the harvest wasn't working. We're not sure. It's
Gary,
still a mystery.
Can I interject just
Yeah.
a thing? So you're saying it kind of ceased about 50 BC. So
Yeah.
did the Glastonbury Iron Age lake villages, and other places in the West Country ceased to function.
Yeah.
And what happened in 50 BC is Caesar destroyed the Veneti ships and destroyed the entire Celtic sea trade. So the whole west coast was defunct, and so the only sea trade available left was Normandy to Kent. That was the only thing,
Yes.
and Caesar controlled that.
The Isle of Wight.
Yeah, but all
Same
of
to the
those
Isle of Wight.
Celtic ship sea trade was terminated.
Yeah.
500 years of Iron Age sea trade gone.
So archaeology and history are well matched there.
Yeah, so the Iron Age lake villages of Glastonbury closed down, and you're saying this went inactive about the same time,
Yeah.
50 BC.
That would make sense.
Behind you there's a very large Bronze Age barrow. There was many of them around here. A lot of them been ploughed out. There's another one over the hill here called Clandon Barrow, and in that barrow they found these gold pieces that were beautifully carved with lozenges. It's in the Dorchester Museum. They were analysed to have come from Ireland, and the book by Wilmot Early, which I spoke about the other day, talks about an overland route that comes past Maiden Castle from Porlock to Portland. So perhaps a lot of trade came here, and perhaps this place was, you know, a great market area during the Iron Age. And maybe the fortifications were about keeping everything safe there. I think a clue is the climatic changes and the changes in the harvest, which we're finding in the ice core layers through either the explosions of Hekla, the volcano in Iceland, which made people probably gathering herds and instead of crops and protecting them here. The other thing, there's a legend that says that it's called Maiden Castle because they kept their maidens up there. Because
they didn't have any left
because
after.
that may be muddled with the stories how the Vikings came and took away the women, you know, killed the men, took away the women, so maybe they thought
And
that
the fact that
this
it's
was a
den.
great enclosure to protect the women. But it's also an idea that maybe Maiden, because it's never been conquered, and Maiden Castle, although they've found bodies who've died from some kind of battle with the Romans, we're talking just 50. There's no great battle that took place here, like Mortimer Wheeler says.
No.
It never happened. Vespasian did come to this area, but I think Maiden Castle's impossible to defend. It's too big.
Yeah.
They could attack at any part of the ramparts, and they would need tens of thousands of people
to manage the whole way.
to manage it and stop them coming in. You better be in a small fortified area in a castle than you are in a hill fort.
That's right.
So that it is definitely not built to withstand the Roman invasions.
Do you think the
When
den
I was out
is
in,
possible?
when I was out in Iran and Afghanistan, every town had its town square was called the Maidan.
Yeah.
Yes, that's it.
My thought on that is the
Markets
den.
town square, I think.
In Cornwall we have dun for a castle or a hill fort type mound.
Maidan.
So you've got the same phonetics in here with that name.
Well, there's also the Dunium on the map of Ptolemy, who came to Britain long before the Romans. He identified a place geographically similar to where Maiden Castle is, and they called it a great citadel called Dunium.
Ah.
And so this I think,
citadel on a hill.
well, you know, in those days, this would still be the most magnificent structure in the south of England.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing like, you go along the coast from Cornwall to Kent, there's nothing
of
as
this
large
scale.
or as this
That's
scale.
right.
So whoever lived here must have, you know, as some people say, been a great king. And some people talk about King Dorian. Hutchins talked about a local tradition of King Dorian who lived in Dorchester but had this as his palace, and people came up here in times of trouble or for ceremony at special times of year.
Yeah.
But there's also another element to here. There's lots of ley lines that go through here, alignments, as Yuri has found, and others. It is an east-west entrance, so it is a ceremonial place. Lots of balls of light. There was a big UFO flap here back in the 80s and 90s, and I've actually been in this car park here in the car watching lights do incredible things over Maiden Castle. So it is a really great place for what I call light watching, or as Andrew Collins calls it in his book. You should have had this, but he probably doesn't know how many light balls are seen here. It's quite often.
Can you tell when they're going to appear?
Well, the best times for them to appear is normally a really clear night when there's not much haze. So I find if you get a really clear night, and there's the moon's not high, of course, and it tends to be around certain days. Andrew Collins worked out that more UFOs are seen on Wednesdays and Thursdays. I don't know. Maybe
When's
that's
the
an
next
idea.
UFO due?
Take the weekend off.
Look at from the sort of number in the caption.
So we've got the dark moon tomorrow, so that would be a good time. Yeah.
But I wouldn't like to put a time and date on when the next sighting is going to be. That's rather like trying to predict when a crop circle is going to appear.
Seismic, sun's doing.
Which brings me to the crop circle thing, because crop circles have appeared in this field and in the two fields on the opposite side of Maiden Castle. When we go up there, I'll show you that there was an actual ancient route that went down from Maiden Castle along the Wey River, down the Wey Valley, past up Wey, through Broadway and down towards Portland. So Maiden Castle and Portland were linked by an ancient route. When the Romans came, they cut through the Ridgeway with a road, which is what we drove down in the coach. That is the main Roman road, and it's just straight as a die, and it runs straight to Mornby Rings, which is another prehistoric site, which we're going next after here. Of course, Dorchester was a huge prehistoric centre with a massive timber circle, 2 henges, bank barrows, and tumuli, and all kinds of ritual objects have been found under the streets. So Maiden Castle would have probably been part of that Neolithic. There was like the high place and the low place, the place of trading and marketing, the place of kingship possibly.
And ceremony.
And ceremony, yes.
So actually it shows that probably those roads were there way before the Romans.
Yeah.
Yes, the Romans didn't really do much. There was a Romano-British temple that was built on top of the hill. But that was mainly for the local people, not really for the Romans. The Romans' villas that are around Dorset were found to be more British royals and chieftains than actual Roman soldiers. I mean, they had a mission and job, and they just went and did it, and they wanted to get back home as soon as possible. So there wasn't that great inter-reaction with the Romans around here anyway. There was more in Colchester, of course, in the east.
It was old Mamutius, wasn't it? Old Mamutius.
Yes.
And he didn't create them, he only revived them.
Yeah. Yes, but the Romans. So the British temple up there is interesting because it's in the Roman style, with a courtyard and an inner temple. But the British adopted the Roman styles, as we adopt styles from different countries as we do at the moment, building styles. But for me, the aqueduct is the most mysterious structure in Dorset, and that runs from Frampton way over there, and it cuts up several valleys to keep, because it's carrying water from a huge spring, and it has to keep a certain level so the water carries flowing. And so you'd think it's easy to carry it straight, but no, this aqueduct went up the valleys, down the valleys, up the valleys, down the valleys, for over 9 miles, and then comes out at the bottom of the bathhouse area of Dorchester. It's a feat of engineering that I think is absolutely incredible. I think I've mentioned it in the talk. But if it was Roman, they would have put viaducts across the valleys to make it easier. So that's why I think these aqueducts are built by the water people, the Roche, or Durotriges, whose hill fork this was probably built by, the major part of it.
From a natural formation in the land initially. It's not a man-made hill, is it?
It's a natural hill that they've modified, yeah. But I think because of where it is and its position, commanding all the routes coming from different parts of the country, it was, and obviously probably the energy of the hill as well, and the fact that there's a massive underground lake under here that runs all the way up to Minton Magna is probably significant, because that's why all the lights, because the light and energy is more about the water than it is about fault lines.
You said the River Wey comes from here.
The River Wey is born just below the hill at Upwey.
Yeah.
And that's one of the largest freshwater springs in Britain. And Portland's water authority have tapped into it, and everybody who lives on Portland is drinking Upwey wishing well water.
Really?
We fill up. Yeah. But unfortunately, they probably stuck a load of chlorine and fluoride in it on the way.
Great so.
Ruined it. But I used to drink it. I used to go into the Upwey wishing well and carry large canisters through, and they were happy for me to do it.
Yeah.
I gave a talk next door about the power of water and the importance of water. But unfortunately those owners went, new owners came along, and the Wessex Water Authority tested the water after 3 days of rain and further downriver, and said it was unfit for drinking, and ever since there's been a sign there said it's
a false positive.
Well they always
false positive.
to stop people drinking it.
Right, well let's begin our journey before it gets just too hot.
And then so you see since '96 how Poundbury has spread westward. And now it's got all sorts of amazing...
There's nothing for me here, but they come here and there's something, because it's a place where it's built to communicate with spirit.
That's what I would dream.
Yeah, that's where you dream. In the middle there will be the place to dream, Lawrence.
Yeah. Just need a girl to come with me.
Is it divine geometry proportions?
Yes, it is. I mean, it is a perfect square.
The double square and all that stuff.
Yep. Yeah. And the entrances were straight through. Sort of temple with a frieze around it and a possible dome or high-pitched roof. It looked like some of the early Roman temples that were round, but this one was square. And those ruins just by there were supposed to be the priest house, but that's just interpretation. But where they probably kept these sort of relics or ritual sort of objects, possibly. I'm not sure. But what we are sure about is that a lot of British native peoples came here to pray. And in the Roman period, it wasn't Roman soldiers coming up here building their own temple in the sacred area that was once a Neolithic village. It's probably that because it has this view down towards Dorchester, where their main walled town was. Not Poundbury, by the way. That's built outside the old walled town, which is in the centre there. Where there's a high building with two sort of chimneys, that's rather the centre of Dorchester. But the old Roman road is the road you see with the cars on at the moment. That was the Roman road. And the overland route came further, nearer the castle. You might see a trace of it here where those cows are, and there's a path here that comes onto the foot. That's the old road. That I call the Bronze Age road.
So when the Romans arrived and they looked at that, they said, "What have the natives ever done for us? Let's stick some tar on the surface."
Yeah, what are these straight roads anyway?
Yeah.
But Cern the Giant is sort of directly north of here.
Not from Arnold. Yes, it is indeed, yeah. It's all hidden. But, well, it's not visual. I just love the graph. But I went up there and down.
Oh, you doubt the outline?
Yeah, I doubt the outline.
I've always enjoyed being here. I've always
How a pagan Roman temple functions, sort of a brief explanation. Some are circular, some are square, and encouraged pantheism, you know, so there was the main figurehead of this particular shrine, but there were all the other gods and goddesses if you needed them. And the centre, the cellar bit in the middle, was high. It could be almost as high as a church steeple, and usually tiled on top, or sometimes wood, and the perambulatory barely above your head. Right. So it's quite a low pagoda almost that you're walking around with the great big shrine as such, you know. And some of them were so tall they did act as fire beacons to others, like church steeples and stuff, you know. Yeah, and this one is a bit more unique. It's got some outbuildings. That doesn't always happen.
Yeah, that lot down there.
So I think on the map they called it a priest hut or something, you know, but often there's just a circle or a square, no outhouses. So there's a bit more of a, if there's some stone structures, you can assume there's also wooden shacks and other things to deal with visitors and pilgrims and so on. So
it's called Came Down Wood.
Came Down Wood?
Came Down, C-A-M-E. Came.
And it was a UFO hotspot?
It's a UFO hotspot. It was certainly during the 80s and 90s.
Right.
I've seen footage of several lights dancing and hovering over that hill. Black triangles have been seen, all kinds of strange things. Okay, when we continue along this rampart and make this turn, you'll see on our right a depression in the ground. That was the Dew Pond, where, you know, if it was a hill fort and people were held inside, captured, or in, you know, sort of escaping the enemy, they'd need a large supply of water, and that Dew Pond supposedly fed them. But if you see this little valley here, that's running directly south towards Portland, that leads to Upway Wishing Well, which has got the largest source of water. But the only problem is that they have to keep sneaking out of the castle to get the water and bring it back. general supply of water at this castle, because the underground lake or spring is many hundreds of feet below us. So there is the Winterbourne River here, which flows this side of the castle, and the Froom, which flows that side of Dorchester. So we are in between two valleys, the Froom and the Winterbourne, but of course they weren't drinkable. So I think they probably somehow layered clay at the bottom of the pit, which made it waterproof, and filled it with water. It must have been hundreds of people collecting and filling it up. And you'll see that the ramparts here are at their lowest as you go round, which was it was like the back entrance to take you down towards Portland. You can see here a good example of the ramparts, 1, 2, 3, 4 sections. So it was highly defended here against anybody coming from the coast, of course. The ramparts, some of them were made with timber poles and then filled and created a box section, and some were actually stone walls from quarries in Upwade, and then earth piled up against the stone walls in boxes, and then it would have been piled over with chalk. So originally this castle was brilliant white chalk. There was no grass on it. So imagine how that stood out. It's this brilliant white citadel, like something out of Lord of the Rings.
The rings being the ramparts.
Yes.
Well, everyone would know where it was.
Where was the dew pool again?
We're going to go around these ramparts, and you'll see it on your right.
Yeah.
Okay, well we'll get going. It's 11:45. Dip. And also parallel with this ancient route through that line of trees that heads towards Upwade. Somebody asked me, is it similar to Avebury, like it was surrounded by water? And I said it wasn't surrounded by water. There was more water. The rivers were higher in those days, but it was more of a long-term ritual site and ceremonial site. It had different purposes, whereas Avebury was for a specific ritual, specific thing that happened at a specific time, because it was built at a time when other great monuments were built around the world. And I think Avebury has had a specific purpose, a tool, if you like, in some ways. And then afterwards it was used for more ceremony, but this initial building was more to do with something that was going on at the time. But that's all part of my new research for some future book. But Maiden Castle isn't the same. It wasn't surrounded by water, there wasn't water in any of the ditches. This was purely a long-term ceremonial ritual site.
We said to Gary earlier that
yes, talk about the dew pond.
The Celts paid great attention to dew ponds, dew pools.
Yeah.
And some of the holes, I think, that you find in stones that are outside places of worship are not for collecting woad or pigments to put on the face. I think they're there for dew. And some of these rings that you see, if you actually look at them, they've got striations in them, and you can imagine that the condensation of the water would run down the striations and then into that little cup, and that would be the dew. Now, the reason why dew is so important is the Celts, and I'm from this tradition, storytelling tradition. A lot of the stories are based around things that are in between states. So the swords, this is my theory, weren't thrown into lakes, they were thrown into mud, because the Celts think that mud, it isn't water, it isn't earth, it's liminal, it's something in between. So a lot of the storytelling traditions reflect this thing, that the magic of the land, the magic of storytelling, resides in this thing that's in between state. Now, for the science, here's the science. Dew is something in between. You walk out on a night, high humidity, and incidentally, it's 95% humidity around here. Now, the relative humidity of the atmosphere is what causes the condensation. Sometimes you go out at night, it's not raining, it's the dew condensing. You reach something called the dew point. It's the temperature at which the water comes from the air to the land. We're in this magical liminal state this mystical state of dew. And I think, it's only my theory, that dew to the ancient peoples, especially the Celts, and it's reflected in the stories. The only thing that we have that's written down is the stories. Well, it's not written down. The only thing that's passed forward is through the stories. So I listen to the stories, and from the stories, the wisdom is embedded within the stories, the spoken word. And it seems to me that this isn't a pool that's going to supply water to feed a population up here. It's a place to come and be bathed and baptised, or whatever the word is. That would be my take, because of this mystical thing about dew. And you can almost feel it now. There's 95% humidity. As we walk down, you're going to reach the dew point, the temperature at which the vapour in the air, and it's the latent heat of vaporization. This mystical thing in science that even the scientists don't understand quite what it is. What's happening?
Well, it's life.
It's life.
Yeah. I was always taught by my mother, principally, that you was lucky to bathe your eyes in the dew. And
The foggy dew.
It's the first thing you do in the morning.
It's in the songs.
You go out
yes, it is.
Beware of the foggy dew.
How lucky you are to be able to do it.
When sunlight first hits dew, ozone is given off. They've seen that in the laboratory, just for the few seconds. So that's why the legends are that if you bathe your eyes in a holy well, when the water reflects, when the sun reflects on the water, that's the most healing time, because it's got ozone in it.
It brings the minerals from the cosmos.
Yeah, that's a good way to view it.
We're nourished from the cosmos.
Very homeopathic.
That's a good way to view it. So dew is magical stuff. It really is.
But also with all the engineering they were doing here, they must have been digging wells.
Good point.
They wouldn't be taking water up from the street.
Good point.
You know, unless they had to, as it were.
Good point.
Yeah, it could well have been very much deeper than that.
So I think this is probably the most powerful place up here. And I'd recommend spending, we should armour here maybe.
And also near here is a tunnel that was found in the 19th century, and it's been buried by a rock now. It's in one of these ramparts. We haven't got time to. It's very difficult to get to, but you can still put your hand in and feel there's a tunnel. And some people say that this hill fort was built by giants, and that the giants were buried underneath this hill fort, and that these tunnels linked with their ancient tombs. So I found a newspaper cutting in Victorian times where they put a cockerel down to see what would happen, and a day later the cockerel appeared, because they must have marked it or something, in the park in Dorchester, very close to where the Roman walls were. The park that's on the sort of the hospital side of Dorchester. There is a definite fissure or tunnel, like all these places, linking the ceremonial place to the market area or the living area.
And a pair of blue eyes. Have you read A Pair of Blue Eyes? St Julia, where Rick's grandparents are buried there.
He was always with me. You like your hair up? So this is the girl catching up. Oh, you've got to get it around it. Yes, Another line, not the other, another line. Right, okay. See you in a minute. All right.
down. We've got to come down anyway, so we've been Dorset and Maiden Castle. It's a much evolved site, formerly a Neolithic henge. What was particularly interesting about it is that inside the ditch was made up of a series of conical pits, 44 in number. And within these pits have been found various objects, particularly phallic objects, and various devoting kind. And they're known to have actually been richly refilled, in fact, a bit like the Albury Circle at Stonehenge, which is also a series of pits, 56 in that case. Later on, when the Romans came to Dorchester, Dono Barrier they called it, they used it as an amphitheatre. And what they did was they lowered the floor about 12 feet, and round the inside of it they put a series of terraces revetted with wood to make seats. And away from the far entrance they built a rectangular stone structure. There's still remnants of it which was discovered in excavation, and these apparently was used to house animals that might have been used for various baiting and fun things that Romans tended to like doing. Up until the 18th century there was a monolith standing in the original entrance, which is over there, which is the northeast entrance, and as you were saying, it could possibly be a midsummer sunrise point. So that's an interesting alignment through the site, lining up to midsummer. Since then it's also been used by the military a couple of times. In the Civil War in 1643 Cromwell's lot used it as a gun emplacement, and later in 1940 it was once again used as a gun emplacement, which was never really had much use as such, I think, and no invasion anyway. So I think that more or less brings you up to date. So it's a much evolved site, and I think, as I say, it's a very large earth sculpture now, and just come enjoy it on that level, I think.
Yes, we seem to find two main lines of energy going through it. One of them seems to go through that northeast entrance that you were talking about.
Interesting, yes.
And the other one was more or less at right angles to it. And Eileen found several other weaker ones that I didn't find, sort of going at different angles to it, but they all seem to meet in the middle.
So it could actually be an energy centre of one kind. That's why it was sited there in the Neolithic times. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
But also, if you think about it being used as a Roman amphitheatre, there's a lot of other things you've cited that you might pick up. A lot of anguish and heartache and death and destruction happened here.
Yes.
There weren't dramas put on, but the Romans were mainly into killing or doing something nasty to somebody.
Yeah.
Dowsing
yes,
up here.
I have, yes. Yeah.
Fascinating, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So as you know, the giant has been dated now to the Anglo-Saxon times.
Yeah.
So a lot of theories have been blown out of the water. Is it a prehistoric? Is it Orion? Is it some prehistoric god? Is it Hercules? One author reckoned that the giant was the Corineus of the Geoffrey Monmouth's History of Britain, the great clash between the giants and the Trojans, and the leader of the Trojans is called Corineus, the leader of the giants is called Go-Maggot, and a battle was said to have been fought off the coast, which I think was Portland, and one author said that the Welsh rendition of Cern is
it's really Cern.
Cern, yeah.
Top sheep a hard carry sort of. Cern. It's
Yes, that's right.
Cern the hunter.
So
it's the
hence why they thought this giant was hence why they thought this giant was one of the ones that battled the great giants in Geoffrey Monmouth's story. But of course that can't be true, because that would have been about 1000 BC.
That's me up there 5,000 years ago. It's much older than the Saxons. They just really did it up. It's been neglected by the Romans.
Well, I think so, because the Anglo-Saxons, there's no image like that in Anglo-Saxon sort of pottery or art or sketches, drawings. It is more Romano-British than it is anything else. So, and I think at any period of time, it only takes a couple of years for it to be covered over with grass and disappear. and it's only if you're really close to it you realise that there's a different, or when it's snowing, the shape sort of appears under certain conditions, crop marks even. So I think the Anglo-Saxons recognised there was something up there, and they probably restored it. But the interesting thing is it's supposed to have been carved at the same time when Cern Abbey here was founded, which was founded in 940 something, long before the Normans came. And that was, I believe, a Benedictine house. And so why would the monks choose to build an abbey below an idol, unless they were here to try and Christianise the place? So that's what makes sense to me, why they built the abbey here. The monks didn't make it, as some people suggest.
I have a theory, nobody agrees with me, but I think that the cock and balls and the nipples actually form a second face, and in medieval iconography a figure that has a normal face and then a lower down face represents the devil.
Oh yes.
And I wonder if the cock and balls and the nipples are actually put down as a second face
to Christianise it, or Satanise it. Yeah. Generally it's always looked like that, but the arm may have been in a different place. It had a cloak, and there was some research in fact discovered that there was recorded a dog below its feet.
So is it Orion then?
Interesting. Just over there is Dogbury Hill Fort. So
and there's sunrise at the altar, isn't it?
Yeah, lots of people like Peter Knight have looked at the archaeology of this place and astronomy and equated it to Orion with Sirius, the dog star. It's possible over at the back of us on the ridge. This ridge is Bellingstone Hill.
Straight at sunrise at the altar.
Yes, there's a ley line, a major ley line that runs through from Stonehenge. There's a major ley from Stonehenge that goes through the church and the Giant and the well, which we're going to see afterwards. So, but the thing is, people still come here at Beltane to get pregnant, and couples who've had trouble conceiving have often come here, and it's been reported locally that they got pregnant afterwards. So it's a fertility feature, I think.
My fourth child is a Cern Abbot.
Ah, there you are.
Well, you had to prove the theory, didn't you?
Yes. But okay, let's forget the Giant because he's putting us off the real history here, and that is the Iron Age history. The Girotrages had their cultural centre here, and maybe they were the first people to carve that figure. Who knows? We don't know.
Maybe not that original figure.
There's no evidence for that at the moment. There is evidence for it being Anglo-Saxon, but we can only presume that they've missed out on the dating. They haven't taken.
For 1,000 years.
Well, possibly, but then they would have found evidence of it under that. But maybe they didn't dig in the right place. Who knows?
That's what I think.
It's probably that.
It's what's been recut. That's what they're measuring from an
The
original
archaeologists have
figure.
found evidence of-
Yes. As Caroline said, there may have been a slightly
another
different
gun
figure.
is a couple of thousand years older than they first thought.
Yeah. But there's earthworks we're going to show you that date back to the Girotrages. The Holy Well itself is a very ancient holy place that obviously goes back to the Girotrages. And then you've got the Abbey right there as well. The Abbey was right in amongst these sacred sanctuaries of the Iron Age peoples to Christianise it. Because the people are still gathering here at solar festivals. And so that's why they built the Abbey here, to try and control that and make it a Christian festival. Same old story, isn't it?
You know about solar power today.
The obelisk is
Cernunnos, exactly, yeah. But what we're going to do is go out of the heat, follow the river around the trees, into the village, and then up to the old Holy Well. We're going to pass the bishop's house, which was once lived in by Walter Raleigh. And Walter Raleigh, some say, was the leader of a group called the School of Night. And it's said by some locals that they may have met in the abbot's house here. So that's interesting because the School of Night were like a Rosicrucian sort of order, sort of discussing the mysteries and using this place because why this place, you know?
Sherborne, wasn't it, as well?
Yes, Sherborne was his home, but they also met here So I think Riley understood that there's a power of this place going back to ancient times. It is a sacred sanctuary, and the centre, almost the centre where the roads cross of the Dratchagese kingdom. So we have the main route was across the back of us here, east-west, which is still a prehistoric route that you can trace on a footpath. And of course this road here, which is a north-south ancient road from Portland towards Cadbury Castle.
Two lines going from his left shoulder. There's two lines, parallel lines. You see, like a cloak.
Yeah, there's an old fence line that's not showing marks of the giant. It was actually held in a kind of pentagram.
That's above it.
The trundle you can just about see if you look carefully. There's a slight raised area, and if you follow his penis up, it goes through the extreme left-hand side of that trundle. It's like clips the edge if that's a lay. Yeah. But his club's pointing right at the trundle, and the trundle they reckon dates back to the Iron Age, and they've found archaeological evidence of a maypole up there, festivals. So they used to go up there at Beltane and dance around the pole. And of course, Christianity, when it came, it converted it into a maypole and made it a Christian event.
If it is Orion, though, that could be represent the Seven Sisters, because that would be the position for it.
Yeah,
possibly. Yeah.
And where the phallus is, of course, represents the star, where stars are being born in the Orion Belt system. So it's just to do with the birth.
Yeah, I think we can put quite a lot.
Orion was a popular motif for such things.
Yeah, well, I think we can stitch quite a lot onto the giant, but the archaeology shows that the settlement above it was very important. There's a henge in that settlement as well. So we have an Iron Age settlement here and a Bronze Age settlement either side of the giant. So archaeology shows us that this place is very sacred to all these different cultures. And I think the Saxons as well, up to Walter Riley, knowing this is a sacred place. So now we're here looking at it with our eyes, and maybe you'll see why it's, or get an intuition as to why it's a sacred place. But the spring is the heart of it.
Yeah.
There's some, and you'll see when you go down there why that is the heart of the energy of this place. Because everything is around of that spring, either side. It's like the centre of all the sites.
The widest and most powerful ley yet found goes through the Cern Giant. Discovered at Pitch Hill in Surrey by Eileen Roche and Gordon Millington, visiting the site of a UFO sighting, this line runs from Leys down on the Isle of Sheppey to Cape Cornwall. Although it varies at different times of day, it's been measured in Surrey at 100 paces wide and grows to a massive 200 paces in the short periods around sunrise and sunset. The UFO sighting at Pitch Hill had some similarities to the Rendlesham sightings in bright light and feeling of time slowed, suggesting proximity to the time engine of a time travel craft.
Unless you clamber over the wire, because you walk up to it, but it's just up to people, those who want to, obviously, The E-line that the Surrey Earth Mysteries Group have been following across Surrey and Kent goes through the chalk figure of the giant near Cern Abbas when extended westwards. We found the line as wide and powerful as usual, much wider than this line superimposed on the aerial photograph plotted by Eileen, which represents its centre. Note, however, that it runs along a field boundary and skirts the Trendle earthwork. The real line would take in the whole of the Trendle. The other line is one found by Paul Devereux, illustrated in the Ley Hunter's Companion and the Ley Guide.
This is the E-line at Cern Abbas. If you follow me down, you can see the figure of the giant long man on the hillside. Now walk. As far as we can tell. Oh, right. Right, well, I think this is more or less the centre of the E-line. which we've traced in the east as far as Laysdown, and this is the furthest point west.
It has a very historic church with some incredible gargoyles. One of them is based upon the giant himself, which we'll show you later.
Yeah.
There's also unusual stained glass windows to look at, which we'll look at after. The water flows from the mill, overflows from the mill pond down the street in a culvert. And this mill pond is fed from the spring that is the source of the power of this ancient place. So they'd sort of sent the water down every single street in Cern Abbas, and collection areas for washing, things like that. But they always came up to the holy well, which we're about to go to now, to drink the water. And locals still drink the water today.
Even
though the Wessex
well, that's
water authorities say it's not safe. Now they're even here too.
Even here.
Yeah.
Have there been votive offerings?
Yes. It's well honoured today. Yeah, locals honour it every Beltane May Day, and at the solstices as well. So, but it is there's some traditions about the well that's written on the wall. It was originally called Silver Well. It has healing powers, of course. People say it was good for the eyes, as most wells are. But as Caroline said before, there's a lot of minerals in the soil around here, and those minerals have gone into the water. They come out with the water from the underground water, and people drink them, and they are really good for us, and it can help almost magically ailments that we had.
But the silver would denote
it appears as if they had miraculous healing.
The silver would denote moon.
The moon, because it is collected into a pool area which the moon would reflect upon, and they also saw that as a magical, and to drink the waters with the full moon on the water. So, but it's unusual. It's in a hollow, and there's all these lime trees. There used to be 12 lime trees that created an avenue down to the well, but unfortunately some of them have died, but there's one or two left still of those original, which they called the 12 Apostles, which they were. But I think we'll go there next.
Yes,
it's a nice shaded area.
Yeah.
Dulo. Yeah.
These
were
the foundation stones of the chapel.
Who's the shade?
You could actually, it's on basically it's an immersion, isn't it?
Yes, there's another immersion, just like some of the Cornish holy wells.
Yeah, St Clear and Dulo holy wells have both got contained areas for immersion.
Yeah, St Clear is very similar, yeah.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't have noticed that.
Well, next time it's here then. Very strong here.
The well has had a triple reputation of being an oracular, a healing and a wishing well. If anyone looks into St Augustine's well first thing on Easter morning, he will see the faces of those who will die within the year. The waters were prescribed for sore eyes and for general ill health. The waters were considered especially good for women, and it was also thought wholesome to dip newborn babies in the water at the moment the sun's rays touched the surface of the water. Local belief had it that the women drinking at the well would become pregnant. Girls could also drink at the well, and putting the hand on the wishing stone, probably the upright one with a St Catherine's wheel carved into it, and pray to St Catherine for a husband. A person could also make a cup of laurel leaves and, filling it with water, face south and wish any wish they wanted. This site is the only holy well in Dorset to have had a shrine, and the lime trees surrounding it were known as the 12 Apostles. The waters were used as a daily drinking water by the houses in Abbey Street up until 40 years ago.
around the giants with his club. Can you see him above the window?
When I first came to Dorset, I joined a kind of club where you help each other out and share skills, and you don't use any currency or any money.
Let's.
That's right, it was the Let's. And a lady rang me up and said, I live in, I run the River Cern, Charminster, and I would really love it if you come and do some decorating for me. And so I said, okay, that's fine. What do you want to do? And she said, just paint some of my outside. I said, fine. So I got here, and she got to meet me, have a cup of tea, and then she said, what are you doing in your life? I said, well, actually, we were preparing to go to New Zealand to sort of explore all the sacred sites. And she said, oh, you need to meet a man called Barry Brailsford, because he's this amazing guy who's been sort of instructed by the Maori to take the Pounamu, the stone of the gods, out into the world to help heal the world. Yeah. And I said, that's fascinating, I must get that book. So she lent me the book, and I read all about this Barry Brailsford, and this was like 2 weeks before I was supposed to go to New Zealand. And I said to her, I said, well, you know, why are you here? I said, because she'd come from Christchurch, where she lived in New Zealand, and she said, I've come here to die. He said, or be healed. He said, I don't know. And I said, what's the story? He says, well, when I worked for the Maori in New Zealand and did some sculpture for them and helped them design a park in Christchurch, and they said to me that that I could be healed if we went to England to a special place. And she had breast cancer at the time, terminal breast cancer, and they saw in their visions that there was a place called the River Cern. And she said that river has healing powers beyond any other river in Britain. So she spent many years trying to find a property, and eventually found one at Charminster that had the River Cern running through her garden. It's that narrow part of the road that where the coach came through, where we had to pass a tractor. And so she after 2 years, she was completely healed of cancer by living by the River Cern and drinking from the source. And I took her up to, we found the source of the River Cern, and the medical field couldn't believe that the cancer had gone into remission. So perhaps the Maori were right. But another trail started, because when I was over there in New Zealand, we got in contact with Barry Brailsford and we met him. And from there, we ended up working with the power of the greenstone, and that sort of tied in with the greenstone story, and Iona, which we're now working with the Holy Axis. So it's just a little job in a little village, you know, meeting somebody, that synchronicity. And I think in a way, the only reason why that happens is because I was open to it, and I didn't think, no, I don't want to do that. And I thought, oh, there's something about this that might be right. So I went with my intuition. But the mystery is, how did the Maoris know about the River Cern? So far away, it's the other side of the world. But they saw that there was this river called the River Cern, and she found it was in Dorset, found the property, and was healed of her cancer. And actually, apparently she's gone back to New Zealand as a new person.
I've read some of the Barry Brailsford as well, and it seems like the elders Maoris they were in touch with a higher source, and they were getting messages through, and I can't see it any other way, that they just got downloads that they knew that they would pass on. They had all these ancient secrets, didn't they, that they suddenly decided it's time to let them out. And Barry was a chosen man.
He was.
And they were waiting for him. They came up to him and said,
they knew he was coming.
We knew you're the one we want.
Yes, and you have something to give me, they said to him. And he brought out his stone and he says, It says, now we can begin the healing.
Yeah, and he went all around America with all the Hopi Indians and all the different tribes, and he would be found the right place to be.
Yes.
It happened. It wasn't organised at all, it just happened.
I mean, technically it was nephrite jade at the Ponema of New Zealand. That's what it is technically. But it has more than just the name, the structure, the energy of the stone from that ring of fire, because it comes out the ring of fire in New Zealand, which is that great fault. Then it's charged with an incredible power. And the mystical thing is, you can't find a seam of it anywhere. The Maoris will tell you, because we went hunting for Ponemu.
Yeah.
And of course Barry says you can never really find Ponemu, you have to have it gifted to you by the Maoris, or you either have a dream about it, go somewhere and find it, which is what happened to us. We were in a camper van by a river, and I had a dream that I had to go up this river. And I went up this river, and I stumbled into a stone this big, and it was nephrite jade.
Oh, the boulder stone.
It was a holder of nephrite jade, Ponemu. And right by the side was two small pieces, one for my partner at the time and one for me. We both picked our pieces up. I still got it at home.
Oh, brilliant.
Technically, it doesn't.
Well, it's doing it good.
All the greenstone belongs to the Maori.
Yeah.
It's not yours. No. You need permission. You need to permit. I found a pebble as well, and I don't think I've got it on. Sometimes I wear it, but I wanted to make it into a piece of jewellery, and.
But that's an arguable thought, because the Maori don't actually own the island. The Maori are actually late comers to the island. The original people were known as the Waitaha, and they were a mixed race of people, including white, red, Chinese even, and Indonesian.
From all over.
As Barry would say.
Yeah, Pacific Island.
The Maori came along, and a sad thing is that the Maori did kill a lot of the locals, because they knew that they would overwhelm their population, so they thought the best way to do this is to forcibly create our own kingdom. But the Waitaha chose not to fight, and as the same that Barry said, they chose to bend their heads, and the Maori just chopped them up. They surrendered their lives because they knew their time, their dynasty, their civilization had come to an end.
It's all kind of subjugated, isn't it, all that history in New Zealand? It's difficult. That someone had come across a group of people that were red-haired and all speaking with Scots accents.
Yeah.
And they were talking about a link, that they had this meeting just outside Nelson to celebrate the fact that there was this connection between Scotland and this place in New Zealand. So.
Yeah.
Fort that is unusual in that it's triangular in shape. Now, what started out in the Iron Age as a very simple single ditch was much later elaborated on by the Dirtreaches, the Celtic tribe in the area, and excavations have shown us a number of hut circles, sorry, not excavations, actually radar in the area over there, and the entire site extends for about 4 acres, and you can in fact continue walking round the top on that way that will take you over to West Bexington eventually. This trig point is a particularly high point that is 15 metres above sea level. So it makes it the highest point for quite some distance. And because we have the 3 hill forts, what we're looking at on the horizon there are the 3 hills from left to right of Leusden, Pilsden Pen, and the largest one to the north, Egerton Hill Fort. Now, it's Egerton and Abbotsby Castle here that form a right-angled triangle with Maiden Castle, which is beyond Hardy's Monument, that we can just we can see on the hill over there. Right. So if you sort of imagine that you're doing this, what would happen was that the Romans did come here, and because this is at Abbotsbury, the most the hill fort really that would be able to notify the other areas of invasion. They were also beacon sites, and looking over, you can see as far on a clear day as Start Point in Devon. It's also a place that I bring groups at winter solstice, and we climb up this very early in the morning with torches and light a little fire here, where we sort of let go of no longer serves us with birch twigs, and the winter solstice sunrise is just behind to the east of Portland, just to the left of the island, and it lights up the entire Isle of Portland and along the Chesil Bank, and it is quite magical. And you probably, those of you that were with us on Friday probably heard Hannah say that from the memory stones there is an alignment over to Golden Cap, which is kind of just beyond Bridport, beyond West Bay. We've got East Bexington, West Bexington, and then Bridport in that direction. Now, when the Romans did invade, the Second Augustan Legion of Vespasian took this fort with little struggle, but they didn't settle here. They then moved on to Maiden Castle, and excavations revealed no evidence of siege or attack, but we do know that they had a Roman signal tower here. There's various mounds that were probably lookout points, and the hill over there is known as the Knoll, and that probably was a burial as well, although we're not entirely sure. But it has been suggested by numerous historians, including Rodney Legg, that this settlement later evolved, as we know it today, into the village of Abbotsbury. And in fact, as well as being a fortification, it was clearly a very safe place for the people that moved down to the more fertile valley to retreat to, should they feel insecure in any way. Now, the interesting thing here is that, as well as being the first line of defence, long before the fleet actually came about from the Ice Age, and we'll talk about that more as we walk along the ridge, that the overlay of Cygnus the Swan, the pole star Deneb, in fact exactly corresponds with this particular site. And it's Andrew Collins that not only endorsed my research some 15 odd years ago, but he tells us that this was circa 16,000 to 15,000 BC that Cygnus was the pole star of the post-Golden Age era. So the Milky Way would have risen from the eastern horizon above Portland to where Cygnus occupied the pole position. And of course, you'll know that this is one of the main stars in the summer triangle, known as the Navigator's Triangle, used by seafarers for orientation long before the modern navigator's equipment. And in the northern hemisphere today, in spring, we see the summer triangle in the eastern sky in the early morning, and in autumn it lies towards the west. So so when we do go down, what I would ask you just to pause a moment at the steps where you're looking at the ramparts. They're not so visible coming up, but you do feel a very different energy as the line goes round. And the area, tree-lined area to that side, I think, was clearly meeting places. The hut circles, there's also thought to have been a Roman villa at the base where numerous amounts of pottery, roof tiles and blue floor tiles have been found. And actually at the centre is a small octagonal earthwork with trees around it. Now, this isn't historic at all. It was actually planted by Dorset's most famous smuggler, Isaac Gulliver, as a lookout for the ships coming in. And they would light up to here and come in on Abbotsbury Beach. And it was Thomas Hardy that called this area of beach below us Dead Man's Bay, because Dorset's very much a sort of county of smugglers.
Oh, plus no, it's spelled out.
From above, along with the swannery, and we're looking down the Chesil Bank to the inlet of East Fleet and West Fleet, and that sort of little bump of land in the Fleet between 4,000 and 7,000 years ago. The Chesil Bank was formed by a combination of material being pushed from the waves, from the last melt, from the last ice age. And so the Fleet, the actual Chesil Bank itself, extends 17 miles to West Bay. But the Fleet itself stops here, and it gets less salt water as it reaches Abbotsbury, and the ideal environment for the eelgrass, for the swans, and it's an area of scientific special interest with all kinds of campions and unusual sort of beach plants and flowers, and there are walks just dedicated to ecology. Tray here has got one of the greatest concentrations of burial mounds in the British Isles. Canute. And King Canute down below us. But that's quite a different story. It wasn't that at all. And I'm going to talk about him down at the Abbey, because he was the King Nut, whose father was Swain Forkbeard, who actually granted the land of the Abbey. And we have got a bit about the history of sitting on animals and do this. It was actually a demonstration to show that man does not have control of the elements. An apocryphal anecdote illustrating the humility of King Canute the Great, and he demonstrated in his years that he was not omnipotent and had no control over the elements, and he was a combined ticket for the gardens, the swannery and the Abbey bar. But the best time, as I say, is when you can see the eggs on their nests and the cichlids hatching, which is from mid-May over to early June. But they are especially protected here. They're one of the only two colonies of swans that don't belong to the Queen. They are part of the English estates when the Abbey lands went, they gave them the Abbey lands, and they went to the Strangways, who were acquired the Abbey and St Catherine's and the entire which included the swannery. And even until the end of the 19th century, they would still have a swan on their dinner table, but because of course they were food. The Benedictines were not allowed to eat four-footed animals, but they did eat the swans. And now that doesn't happen, and if you're found abusing or catching or taking a swan in any way, the fine in the 18th century was the payment of enough wheat to cover the Swan, and that included its 6-foot wingspan, and that was almost your winter supply. So, and the quills from Abbotsbury are still to this day sent to Lloyd's of London to be for the dog book. So, and that is the book that records all the accidents of shipping. And there is a, so there is a sort of, I'm just looking at the bit I had. I've got something else here. Oh yeah, the other thing to say is that the wave actions has graded the pebbles. So as the years have gone on with the erosion, towards West Bay, the pebbles are more or less the size of a pea, and they get larger as you get towards Portland. And in the days of smuggling, it was always said that the boats coming in could tell where they were in the dark from the size of the pebbles underfoot. And the Napoleonic Wars, of course, forced the price of the wheat and liquor to prohibitive levels for the poor, and so they could earn more than a week's wages working for the smugglers. And in 1752, the London Journal recorded that all the people of Abbotsbury, including the vicar, are thieves, smugglers and plunderers of wrecks. We are in front of the Church of St Nicholas at the moment, but the abbey was dedicated to St Peter. Now some of you I know have been inside the church and others haven't. And I seem to be talking to about 4 people at a time, because this side of the church is the oldest part. It was attached to, this has now become the parish church, with a north-facing door, and one of the abbots is in the porch. Some of you I know have been inside. It does seem quite Catholic, because the east window was blocked off after the Civil War, and there is a very gold ornate screen of Eredos with the 10 Commandments there. And I don't know if you noticed when you went in the pulpit that is Jacobean. When the abbey was acquired by the Strangways family in 1541, the Earls of Ilchester became the owners of the estate, and that included St Catherine's, the Swannery, and all the abbey lands. At the front, on the south side, it's less ornate, because that was attached to St Peter's Monastery Church. So Abbotsbury itself had been one of the most important monasteries in Dorset, and it was established here in the 11th century. And we know that the register, although it was destroyed with the Civil War, and incidentally the pulpit has got a couple of bullet holes when there was the clash between the parliamentarians and the royalists. Coker states that in his survey in the county of Dorset, that here at Abbotsbury, he calls it, was built in the very infancy of Christianity among the Britons, a church to St Peter by Bertufus, a holy priest unto whom the same saint had often appeared, and among other things gave him a charter written with his own hand. However, by the time King Canute, who was the king here, he's very interesting, and because King Canute married Emma, and Emma was the previous wife of Ethelred the Unready. And I've got a complete separate thing about Emma and how important she was here. But the actual, all said about building the abbey, he was given the lands by Canute, being his servant. Now his wife was Tola. We know that King Canute was one of the Vikings, and it actually helped originally with the invasions, because the king was in fact Norse, and he gained this enormous North Sea Empire, King of Norway, a little bit of Sweden, of Denmark, and of most of Britain except London. And there's a charter dated 1024 when Nut bestowed Portisham and Abbotsbury on his servant Orcus. Orcus, who we know as Org, was married to Tola. Tola came from Rouen in Normandy, and it's from Tola that we get the village name Tolpuddle. Oh. So they, according to Coker, the monastery built by Orcus was stored with Benedictine monks from the Abbey of Cern, and he confirms from the rules drawn up for his guild or fraternity of St. Peter that a society existed here previously that was later converted into the monastic establishment. Other historical records tell us that he kicked out a community of secular canons in order to install the Benedictine monks. Now, Edward the Confessor, who came later, after Orc's death, when Tola donated all their lands at Abbotsbury to the monastery here, and that made the monastery very rich because they acquired other houses in different villages as well along the coast. Now, Campbell gives us a codex that Edward the Confessor by another chapter gave Orcus, who was his housecarl, as he had been Canute's. So Orcus kind of like hung around a bit with kings, became the servants, and he was then given all the shores in his lands and all the wrecks of the same. So they didn't only have these monastic lands, so as we go round we'll see how far it extended. They were granted the phrasing goes, and William the Conqueror then testifies, for the love of God and the soul of his kinsman, King Edward, he had granted to the abbot and brethren of Abbotsbury their land as free and quit as it was held in the time of his predecessor, together with the right of sock, sack, toll, team, invange thereof, and wreck of the sea. And he desired the abbey should lose nothing unjustly, but should be honourably treated. And then, after the death of Tola, and Leland tells us that they were buried here, but we don't seem to have any evidence for that. The Domesday survey states there were 2,500 acres and 8 manors held by the abbey by 1066. Abbotsbury, Tolpuddle, Hilton, Portisham, Shilvinghampton, Wootton Abbas, Bolton and Stoke Abbas. And over the next 4 centuries this grew into 22 manors. And however, there was always this kind of issue about the taxes between the abbots. There is a long roll of all the abbots, and there was all these fallings out because they were expected to look after the infirm from other monasteries. And in fact, there was an occasion when Glastonbury Abbey sent several people here that Sherborne had refused to take, and they gave them 16 horses for the privilege. There was, of course, also a convent, and the first reference we've got for that is 1166, when Roger the bishop had custody of the abbey, and he gave 2 hides of land at Stoke Abbot for the marriage of his niece, the deed being contrary to the wish of the convent. And that Red Book of the Exchequer is the first reference that we've got that there were nuns here too.
Right.
So this abbey that extends up to the Tide Barn, the Tide Barn being only half the size of it that it once was, and it was originally stone roof, but it was thatched centuries, and the chapel were the only 2 buildings that the Strangways didn't pull down. And it's a complete fallacy to think that it was Henry VIII that actually got rid of all the buildings. He didn't. He was giving land to the earls of the time, or the nobles, if you like, under a charter, under conditions that they themselves paid to have the buildings demolished. And that's how Strangways gained such a lot of property, and they were able to build their manor house because, of course, they had access to all the stone from the previous abbey. And so Abbotsbury escaped none of the burdens, and so they gained the royal patronage, but it was kind of a mixed blessing, really, because this order to receive and provide maintenance for various hostages as well as the infirm sort of made them fall out a bit, and there's a kind of record in 1339 that the Abbey of Abbotsbury was ordered to receive and provide maintenance for 2 hostages to be sent from the Abbey of Glastonbury, and in October of the same year they were ordered to transfer them to the Abbey of Tavistock, and the monks of Tavistock appear to have flatly refused. But the convent, however, in 1390 obtained from then Boniface IX, who replaced Pope Urban, appropriating new parish churches, and because they then got 5 new parish churches, they actually didn't walk out. Then we have very little reference apart from the appointment of abbots in the 15th century, but there are decrees published by the then Bishop Chandler, and there was I think there was a sort of a chapel, Chandler's Chapel here at one point, after visiting in 1436. And he wrote to them in no uncertain terms. The community were warned generally against making grants rashly, and greater formality in their drawing up was required. The abbot was directed, and I'm quoting here from Sarum Epistle, Chandler's, as wine and women cause men to err, not to buy more wine than was absolutely necessary for the use of the monastery.
You got the wine, boy.
He was permitted to have sweet wine for his table and the entertainment of his guests in small and minute vessels. The entrance of women was prohibited. The abbot, if convicted on the evidence of 2 witnesses, should be suspended for a month. The brethren were forbidden to resort to a certain chamber for the purpose of confabulation.
A certain chamber.
Certain chamber. So, you know, the abbey here dominated the life in Abbotsbury for about 500 years, until politics and religion kind of overtook events with the Civil War, and then the Strangways, Sir Giles Strangways, who got the manor house, it was kind of blown up because he was storing all this gunpowder there and hiding people, and so the manor house, the parliamentary troops in 1644 blew up his manor house. And it wasn't until Charles II that he subsequently restored the Abbotsbury estate to the Strangways family, and the Earls of Ilchester. Charlotte Townsend is now the present incumbent, and it remains with them to this day. Now, what's interesting is with the manuscripts, there was a copy of what's known as the Abbotsbury Bible, found earlier, only about 20 years ago, and it was recovered from Rouen, where some of the relics of St Catherine were deposited by the monks from St Catherine's Monastery at Sinai. And curiously, how that happened, we don't know, because it got to Rouen from Germany, but Tola came from Normandy. So there's a kind of interesting thing about how we understand where a bit like Wren's documents on Portland, and I do know where some of those are, and it was told to me by the old tour guide that I'd known for about 40 years at St George's, where some of Wren's papers went that weren't burnt. But the interesting thing about this manuscript that is now at Lambeth Palace is that almost all the decorated initials incorporate a Catherine wheel, which might not be except was dedicated to St Peter. So yeah, so that's quite so that's sort of quite strange. I mean, I think
is Rouen Benedictine?
Well, it wasn't because it was more connected with the Norman Conquest, and the Queens, because the whole thing about Queen Emma is that she came from, well, the documents that tell us about her life come from Flanders.
Right.
But she had lots and lots of far-reaching strategies that, had it not been for Queen Emma, we may well have become ruled by the Danes. And I'll explain why in a moment. Now, Emma of Normandy was the wife of two Anglo-Saxon kings of England. First, Ethelred the Unready, who reigned from 970 to 1016. And Nut, who's Canute, who reigned from 1016 to 1035.
So it wasn't Anglo-Saxon.
No, but he became so because, well, he sort of became so because of his sons, didn't he? In a weird way. I mean, Nut was never Anglo-Saxon.
These are all foreigners to me, they're not British.
No.
Wipe them all back in the sea.
No, but you see,
Saxons,
but
Angles,
because
Danes,
Canute, Nut's father was Sweyn Forkbeard, the Viking. And then after Ethelred the Unready died, his wife Emma, who's known in England often by Elgifu, yeah, she's the same one. So, you know, she then marries Canute. And so we've got to remember that this was the time of the Viking forces when they were attacking England, and particularly Elizabeth. And in the wake of the Scandinavian attacks on both England and Normandy, that's when Emma was sent to England from France to marry Ethelred. His first wife had died. And it's her children that give us our history, because she had about 10 children. With Ethelred, three of her children were Edward, who became Edward the Confessor, Alfred, and Godgifu. And these three went into exile in mainland Europe before the King of Denmark conquered England in 1016. So then you've got the King of Denmark kind of cavorting with the Anglo-Saxons. But in fact, they don't mind too much because his presence here and his rule is helping them not get so many attacks from the Vikings. So Emma apparently had quite a good relationship with them. Oh yeah, no, we'll be all right. Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, no, we'll be all right because a lot of them aren't going, and we'll do the short way. So. And after Ethelred's death in 1016, when she married Nut a year later, she then had at least another 2 children. And they were the future Harsnut, who reigned here from 1040, and Gunhild. Now that daughter, she made a very clever arrangement with the son of the Roman emperor. So not only was Emma an important figure in Nut's government, she also was an advisor to the king, and there is a surviving manuscript of both of them at the Minster in Winchester, where they were also remembered as major benefactors. So they were actually helping with Christianity here. And then after Nut's death, Emma was influencing Anglo-Saxon politics as she tried to make one of her sons, Harthanut or Edward, King of England. She didn't seem to really mind which. But that's when their claims to the throne were challenged by Harold Harefoot. And he was Nut's son with his first wife, the English Elgifu. So it all gets terribly complicated. It's taken me quite a while to work this out, because Harthenard and Harold ruled England jointly after 1035 for a couple of years. And some of the chroniclers seem to suggest that Emma may also have encouraged a failed invasion of England in 1036 by her sons Edward and Alfred, and that's when Alfred died. So all we've got left is Edward. And when Harthenut dies, Edward becomes Edward the Confessor as King of England. So, you know, when Harthenut were driven into exile, Harold Harefoot dies in 1040, at which point Harthenut becomes king. And he wasn't particularly very popular. But then when he dies, that's how we get Edward the Confessor.
Things settle down a bit with him.
Gary told me something quite interesting, because when I was saying to him about, you know, I'm kind of realising how important Emma was, not just to the fact that the relationship, because we still think here at Abbotsbury, the Abbey came about through Orkatola, and the land, and it was the land was given to Ork by Nuts, by Canute. But then when you look at his marriages, and the fact that he married Emma, who had these at least 10 children, Gary said to me, and yes, and she spent a lot of time at Rufus Castle on Portland. And I said, well, I've never really worked out who these 10 children were. He said, well, you won't, because at least 2 of them died stillborn or in infancy, and they were buried at St Andrews. Now, I didn't know that, and I thought that was really interesting. So, you know, we've got these really kind of quite important effectively Queen of England, who left this most amazing legacy.
Yeah.
Because the later chronicles suggest that her marriage to King Ethelred the Unready led to the Norman conquest in 1066, because what it meant was that the Dukes of Normandy became related to the Anglo-Saxon kings of England. So they then had a hereditary claim to the throne. So had it not been for this story about King Canute sat on Abbotsbury Beach pushing back the waves, we could have actually ended up with a Danish king.
Yeah.
And it's all sort of, you know,
strategic politics.
I mean, she's a very good example of how a powerful medieval English woman, involved on both sides of the Channel and in Scandinavia before the Norman conquest, set the scene for what later happened, really.
Acted in diplomacy almost.
Yeah, absolutely, but also very carefully manipulative, particularly getting her daughter married to the son of the Holy Roman Emperor.
Regime building.
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, what's interesting today is that 2 o'clock this morning was the new moon in Virgo.
Right.
So we've got this sort of powerful women here. We've got the St Catherine, and as of this time here, we've got the sun and the moon align in the sign of the corn goddess with Mercury, the planet of communication. So we're really honouring the goddess at this crucial sort of point in the wheel of the year, in the zodiac. There was a message last night that came through from a post by the astrologer John Wadsworth that actually said that this alignment with the sun and the moon with the harvest goddess is a moment that epitomises the wisdom of the divine feminine.
Well, yeah.
And, you know, a crucial moment of trusting our bodies, remembering to be in the physical, because the corn grows on the earth and we walk the earth. So all this I am being spiritual kind of takes us out of the awareness of the spirit of the land.
Yeah.
Even have become part of the Strangways Manor. So the actual monastery would have extended, it would have been attached to the church and extended down just a little beyond here, and covered, because of the slope, it would have covered most of the land towards the car park. The Abbey House has got some quite old sections, and I've actually been in there with a psychic friend, and we had some amazing experiences that the owner got. We talked, that was quite weird, that was still but in their garden is the Roman well, but it's thought that the Abbey Chapter House may have formerly been what's now the restaurant with the gardens. The infirmary. The Abbey Chapter House is sort of slightly beyond, going round a bit, where those other buildings are over there.
Yeah.
And then the gatehouse, and you get there is quite a powerful energy line that goes from here through that arch. I don't know. Yeah, the archway, we don't quite know whether that was part of the manor or part of the original abbey. But the barn in front of us, it's interesting that Giles Strangways did not demolish it. Only one half was demolished. So there's a theory that possibly half of the barn belonged to the parish and the other half to the monks. But some historians say it was originally built by the monks in the 1390s, others that it was a bit later. The general consensus seems to be that it was built around the early 14th century at about the same time as St Catherine's Chapel, and it's actually one of the finest in the land. It measures 272 feet long and 31 feet wide, and claims to not only be the largest barn of its type in England, but to show how powerful the church was at that time. So why did part of it survive? Was it because Strangways felt that the West End belonged to the local farmers rather than the monks? And it was all once originally under a stone roof, and it's been rethatched this side recently in 2016. But as the wealth of the abbey increased, all the local people had to pay the tithe of 1/10 of their reed and grain. And the reed, of course, was as valuable, if not more so, than the grain, because it provided not only the thatch, but the food for the birds and for the wildlife, along with the eelgrasses. But they don't actually eat it now. They grow it at the side separately. So I never understand why they say that reed was, valuable food thing, because I can't see how.
I can't see how.
I think it's kind of the fact that that they used it for nests rather than food.
It was part of the process.
It's all part of the cycle to maintain
right.
the breed. Because at one time there were 1,200 swans here. But what we are going to do is walk up to St Catherine's.
Although no records survive of the chapel's construction, the chapel's been dated in style to the late 14th century, the same time as Abbotsbury Tithe Barn was built. The chapel is built on a definite platform which could have been originally for a pagan temple. It was St Augustine's policy that his priests set out from Rome around 600 AD to convert the English would replace pagan temples with Christian churches and chapels. The early Christian missionaries would naturally try to choose a patron saint that continued as closely as possible the pagan dedication of the temple, so it's likely to have been a goddess temple. It was very powerful and peaceful, and the acoustics seemed very good. St Catherine is the patron saint of spinsters and virgins, particularly those in search of husbands, and until the late 19th century the chapel had a local tradition where young women of Abbotsbury would wish, which involved using the niches provided, one for a knee and two other for the hands, in the east jamb of the south doorway to post prayers and make a wish to the saint asking for her help and aid. A traditional prayer used here says, "A husband, St Catherine, a handsome one, St Catherine, a rich one, St Catherine, a nice one, St Catherine, and soon, St Catherine."